more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man.
Very obviously.
Egomania, worship by the people down below, power is never satisfied, the need to go down in history as a mover and shaker, and ultimately to make everyone bend the knee worldwide and say, yes sir, 3 bags full sir, is the dream of the psychopath. And we must recognize it now, because they are in charge. They are going to use the terror techniques shortly. They have many new words. They're good at making up words to camouflage their actions, like rendition is where they just kidnap people and throw them off to some other government where they can get tortured, while we watch the sports and the soap operas and the comedy shows and listen to trivia that's presented as news. Horror is already happening, has been happening now for some time, while we get entertained. Those who are growing up now, who are idealistic as most young people are, will have to face this. For those who are older and who understand it, I'm sick of the response, well, thank goodness the worst will happen when I'm dead. Well, maybe not, because it's speeding up pretty quickly. And what a way to throw off your own responsibility onto the next generation. It's disgusting. It's disgusting as a response. The reason we are now at this stage is because the previous generation had the same attitude. When they had credit cards thrown at them, regardless of their credit rating, and they go on a binge and spending spree of debt, while the big boys played their games and spun their web across the planet, and everyone entertained themselves and gorged themselves on pastimes. And that's passing the buck. And what will they all do when the buck stops? And you've brought children into a world where they have no say as to what they want to do. And like every generation, they learn by doing. The mistakes they make too, it's their choice to do so. That's how you learn anything, is by making the mistakes, and they must be allowed to do all that. To be brought up in a world which is rigid, and experts will monitor you from cradle to grave like a specimen. It's not human. That's not human. And we cannot leave it on their shoulders. Also, the younger generations have had more inoculations than any other previous generation. Again, a warfare tactic, which makes perfect sense. You don't want a well-educated, bright population on the go when you're making drastic changes in society. These things were discussed a long time ago in warfare circles. We are in the midst of the final stage of this, and we have to push on now while we can. And there's a lot of good people out there of all ages who understand what we're talking about, and rather than feel helpless, they're starting to get involved and speaking out to the right people. And we'll keep going as long as we can. For myself and Hamish the dog, it's good night, and may your God or your gods go with you. keep telling people not to put their faith in the lone hero who's going to come out of Hollywood and save everyone. Each person is their own champion, and your first battle is with yourself. To be an individual will take some sacrifice. To be an individual will not win friends from the bulk of the populace. To be an individual, you might be very lonely. Can you stand loneliness? What's the other side of it? See, a person who really should be an individual and knows it themselves will often marry and do all the things and live miserably ever after. To try and conform and to have those things he wants or she wants to have. And yes, he will be accepted, and yes, there will be a face put on in public, but inside they're depressed. That's why true individuality is not for everyone. That's why there's always been a mass. Studies down through the ages have shown that the masses enjoy being the masses. Witch hunts don't have to be done by churches, because the mass can turn on anyone they don't like. It's happened down through history. It's still happening today. The mass wants to be one, the same as the elite want them to be one. The purpose of life is not to lose yourself, it's to find yourself, regardless of public opinion. Because life must be meaningful to you. Same techniques, same con, same ancient religion at the top. And for those who can catch on to it, do your homework, study, and don't be afraid to be different. From Hamish the dog and myself, it's good night, and may your God or your gods go with you.
Not very far from Edgewood, in historic Frederick, Maryland, are the biological warfare laboratories. Here, men and women of science are doing basically the same type of work as in other government, university, and industrial laboratories. A combination of medical and public health research. While I was at Fort Detrick, I was able to follow partway through an experiment to determine the effectiveness of an agent. Volunteers are important to the testing picture. For many years, information has been needed on the effect of a biological warfare attack on man, so that we can have a better understanding of how to defend ourselves against it. The volunteers were a picked group. They had received psychiatric interviews to determine their maturity and reliability, as well as mental outlook. Medical histories and laboratory checks on the volunteers had been extremely stringent. Any history of a chronic disease, any allergic reaction or nervous disorder was a cause for rejection. Volunteers were given the opportunity to drop out at any time. I was to watch the progress of the experiment from the control room. The volunteers had been positioned in cubicles on the outside of the test sphere, a hollow steel ball 40 feet in diameter, in which a cloud of biological warfare agent can be generated. Through a series of controllable valves and a face mask, it was possible to expose a person in each cubicle to a measured volume of biological aerosol from the sphere. I said before I was able to follow part way through the experiment, the final part. As was expected, the volunteers were temporarily incapacitated, but within a short time they were up and around, completely recovered. They had the satisfaction of having played an important part in obtaining information, which would immediately be given to the Public Health Service to bolster our defenses against disease. Research has led to many scientific findings beneficial to mankind, such as a perfected vaccine for controlling industrial anthrax, a usually fatal disease of cattle and sheep. Still another accomplishment, protective devices for the safe handling of disease-causing microorganisms and their harmful products. Just a few of the many byproducts of biological warfare research.
All right, welcome to the Bio-PsyWar Tick-Tok Bio-Op Part 2. It's the Tick-Tokeration, the Tick-Toperation Apocalypse. It is the Bio-PsyWar from TylerBloyer.com. We do these shows live. It's like a radio show, except for there's no FM or AM bands being broadcasted out. And it keeps me active. It keeps me consistent with sitting down and being able to produce the show, which I've been trying to kind of get into that groove for a while. Life happens, things come up, but as I've been saying, everyone, can have, should have, I don't want to imply what you should be doing, but their own Wayne's World show, their own Tom Green show for those millennials among us or whatever, Gen X. I'm not sure exactly where the boundaries are with that. But yeah, today we're going to be continuing on with the Bio-PsyWar, as you can see. And we are now in part 6 or so of the Bio-PsyWar. I don't like to number things, although I've been reconsidering now with this series. Maybe there should be numbers that go along with these things or parts. But anyway, it's the TylerBloyer.com Stream of Consciousness show, going back to about 2015, where I did the Creature of Control. And in that series, I covered a lot of eugenics, crypto-eugenics, social Darwinism, and it was a shorter series, but it was my first kind of adventure into producing content. And from there, we did the Liberty Lifestyle podcast and interviewed some interesting people. I needed to take some time and kind of reanalyze where I sat in the mix of things. And since about a year and a half ago, got back into things in June of 2019. So, almost a couple years ago now. And then restarted the Bio-PsyWar series recently in December of 2020. So we're going to be covering more today about the Bitten book from Chris Newby, as well as going into the Lyme disease background and asking some questions and uncovering some artifacts and pulling out some different things. Really quick, though, that ball, now if you were watching the intro, I play the intros because it gives me a minute to check on the tech, get things going. I like the idea of jumping into an intro to kind of set the theme. I guess first, let me kind of see what I want to mix in, how I want to mix this. Let's discuss Alan Watt. Now, he was featured there in the beginning. It might not make sense in the Bio-PsyWar series why Alan Watt was featured right there. Well, recently on March 4th, 2021, Alan Watt passed and is no longer here with us in this dimension or this reality. But Mr. Watt was someone who influenced me heavily over the years. I have always appreciated his work and the way that he's stuck with recording his take on things, and not only that, but really uncovering the Fabian angle and Fabian socialism, and going into figures like Bertrand Russell and Sydney. I'm having a Sydney Webb and Beatrice Webb, and the people that around there that started the Fabian Society, which became like democracy essentially. And democracy as we have it now, especially socialist democracy, would be coming from the Fabian Society. And anyway, people that Alan Watt, going back to Alan Watt without getting caught up down in that area, would be someone who I would definitely recommend checking out. His work over the years at cuttingthroughthematrix.com, which I'll pull up here on the site. It's a nice classic looking old internet site here, and his work, as far as for now, I don't know how things are going to be moving forward, is available, for free, for download, for you to archive, for you to go through and listen to. As you can see, even just on the front page here, there's a large voluminous amount of links and things to go check out. But right up until the end, and I'm not sure how he died. I'm not exactly sure what happened there. One of the channels you can check out that mirrors his work on YouTube, because he wasn't someone who was going to go and upload to YouTube. But yeah, his work on like technocracy and linking together cybernetics, and then linking that up to the current time and even predicting things that were going on now back in like 2008. You could watch this video with Thomas Sheridan and the video he did last week announcing Alan Watt's death. That's where I first heard of it. Otherwise, I probably would have touched on it last week on my show. But right up until February 28th, Alan was producing work, and they weren't like recorded a long time ago and then broadcast at this time. He actually was doing the work. So again, seems kind of sudden. He wasn't mentioning that he was like severely ill during that time. I'm not insinuating any kind of conspiracy, but he did speak about them big boys at the top, as he would say, and him and Amos the dog. And I don't know if the dog was still around towards the end either. Hopefully the dog's fine. And again, it seemed kind of sudden. Thomas hasn't insinuated anything was out of the norm, and I have not looked into it much more beyond that. Now, in that opening book, so again, go check out his work, and I would recommend archiving it on your own local hard drive, at least a handful of the episodes, because you can kind of get the idea. And if you like Alan and his particular style, then there's plenty of work of his available to go through. And there's not a lack of information, essentially. There's plenty of people that have exposed what's going on, and Alan Watt being one of them. Not Alan Watts with the S, not the guy, the psychonaut. He's got some good work too. Him, I would not probably promote on my channel, and I think he does have more of a shady background, Alan Watts. But Alan Watt, the guy from Ireland who lived up in Canada, was awesome, and I wanted to make sure and pay a little bit of a tribute to him here anyway. And then on the desk, I have, if you notice that ball they were showing in that Fort Detrick, Maryland, little, whatever that was, clip from back in the 50s. They mentioned a ball, and they were talking about like a chamber. And I just recently got Annie Jacobson's book, Operation Paperclip. It's the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America. I appreciate Annie Jacobson's work. I know she might not be going fully in depth on every detail, but as far as like getting a good handle on at least some of the information, I think it's a good place to start. And I would need to go through this more before I say, I highly recommend the book. But I think this book is more well known of hers than the other one that I have gone through quite a bit of, The Pentagon's Brain. The Uncensored History of DARPA, America's Top Secret Military Research Agency. This book I've gone through quite a bit, and then the kids have colored all over it, and it's been worn in my hands, and it's, I'm kind of a nerd for that kind of information. But I think she's more well known for this book. And let me see if I can get that where I want it. And I just wanted to read here from page 290 of Operation Paperclip, from the Chemical Menace chapter from Annie Jacobson's book, Operation Paperclip, kind of to give a little context on that ball they were talking about there. It says, it had been a year and a half since the Merck reporter on the biological weapon threat had been released, and an influx of congressional funding had transformed Camp Detrick into a state-of-the-art bioweapons research and development facility. The Army purchased 545 acres of land adjacent to what had been called Area A, and created a new area designated Area B. How creative. Where some of Detrick's first post-war field tests with crop dusters had sprayed and spray hoses would occur. During the war, dangerous pathogens like anthrax and X had been tested and cultured inside Detrick's germ lab, and rudimentary wooden buildings covered in black tar paper and nicknamed the Black Maria by scientists. During the war, the industrial-sized boiler used for fermenting sat on the lawn outside of the germ lab. Now, given the scope of work planned for the immediate future, Detrick needed an aerosol chamber that was bigger and better than anything else like it in the world. The job of designing such a structure was assigned to a bacteriologist named Dr. Harold Batchelor. Detrick's British counterparts at Portrand Down had an excellent chamber of their own, but it only fit 2 or 3 mice. What Batchelor came up with was a monstrous spherical 1 million liter chamber called the 8-ball, shaped like a giant golf ball and held upright by iron legs. The Chicago Bridge and Iron Works was commissioned to build the 8-ball to specification that made it airtight and bomb-proof. The 8-ball was to have portholes, doors, and hatchways, and a steel wall of 1.5 inches. So describing that ball, they called it the 8-ball. That was that ball they were talking about in the beginning there. Inside the 8-ball, airflow would simulate weather systems, with scientists on the outside controlling temperatures on the inside. Within a range of 55 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity could be controlled inside the 8-ball to flow between 30 and 100%. This state-of-the-art environmental control would allow Detrick scientists to understand how aerosolized biological agents would work at different altitudes in open air. The sphere would weigh more than 131 tons and would stand 4 stories tall. A car walk around the center would allow scientists to observe through portholes the test subjects sitting inside as they were exposed to the world's deadliest germs. The Chicago Bridge and Works agreed to deliver on the date 1949. Again, reading for those who just joined, Operation Paperclip from Annie Jacobson's book regarding the 8-ball, giant test laboratory for aerosol agents, where the people at Fort Detrick, Maryland, were deploying germs and biological weapons on people and testing it out. And that we showed a clip of it in the beginning, so I'm just reading a little bit about that in the book here. With the chamber's design complete, Dr. Batchelor prepared to travel to Germany. There was an important scientist who was just now becoming available for an interview. This was a man who knew more than most anyone else in the world about biological weapons. He was particularly knowledgeable about weaponized bubonic plague. The physician was Dr. Kurt Blom, the former Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich. He had just been acquitted of war crimes at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. Now he was back at on the paperclip list. The doctor's trial had been over 44... let me start again. The doctor's trial had been over 42 days. It was October 2nd, 1947, and a message from Heidelberg marked, quote, secret and confidential, unquote, arrived at the desk of the chief of the Chemical Corps, and it read, Quote, available now for interrogation on biological warfare matters is Dr. Kurt Blom, unquote. A meeting was arranged for November 10th, 1947 between Blom and Batchelor. Present alongside Dr. Batchelor were Dietrich doctors Dr. Charles R. Phillips, a specialist in desterilization. I was going to say decentralization. No, a specialist in desterilization, Dr. Donald W. Falconer, an explosive expert, and Dr. A. W. Gorelick, a dosage expert. Lieutenant R. W. Swanson represented the U.S. Navy, and Lieutenant Colonel Warren S. Leroy represented the Army's European Command Headquarters, and interpreter and stenographer were also present. Dr. Blom was told that in advance that everything discussed would be classified. Dr. Batchelor first spoke, setting a tone for all of the day affair. Quote, we had come to interview Dr. Blom personally as well as professionally, unquote, Batchelor said. Quote, we have friends in Germany, scientific friends, and this is an opportunity for us to enjoy meeting Dr. Blom and to discuss our various problems with him, unquote. To begin, Batchelor asked, quote, would it be possible for Dr. Blom to give us an overall picture of the information that he has, the nature of the world under discussion, unquote. Blom spoke in English, pausing on occasion for the interpreter to help him with a word. Quote, in 1943, I received orders from Goring for all the research of biological warfare, unquote, Blom explained. Quote, all the research for biological weapons, BWs, would fall under the name Cancer Research. In German, cancer research had already started long before that, and I was already working all the time, but in order to keep this development secret, the Reich discussed it. Disguised it, Dr. Blom laid out the command structure for those involved in, let's see, how far did I plan to read this? Okay, so that's interesting. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to well, anyway, this book I'm going to have to bring back into the scene anyway, but yeah, there's a lot more about Blom and Dietrich and them working together, and this character, Eric Traub, comes up. There's some interesting individuals pointed out in this book, and it's really just like a laundry list of the Operation Paperclip operation, and the Nazi scientists that were brought over to continue their biological weapons, or what you just learned there, what we just learned, because I had not read that part yet, actually, I was kind of reading ahead, about cancer research is actually biological weapons research. And if we can connect the dots further, just me leaping way ahead, I mean, the whole vaccine industry seems to be one big giant military operation. And vaccines themselves, or even the CDC, being a part of a hierarchy of military. And so we see weaponized medical establishment, essentially. We see that the medical industry, the medical cartel, the medical technocracy now across the world is actually just really a militarized front for cancer research, weapons research, infecting people with viruses, and seeing how that reacts, all in the name of defensive warfare, of course, and all in the name of national security and science. So we'll come back to that book further down the road, and a lot more of the connections therein. And for now, what I would like to touch on just a little bit today now is the brain model that I have built over the years. Has a Bio-PsyWar section now, and this brain model has been crafted from the ground up. There's been no importation of any other databases. This has been painstakingly really started from my research on the Federal Reserve System quite some time ago, and now I will give credit to those that introduced me to the brain model, people like Richard Grove, may even be in the audience here today, or at least tuning in for a little bit here and there, as I know he's a busy guy and only has one day off a week or so. But today, enjoy your day off, and last night's lecture was great, by the way. But the brain model here for tylerbloyer.com, you can find at tylerbloyer.com/brain, and I kind of started around the Federal Reserve System, and then that moved more into my creature of control research, which I will be mixing back into the end of this series, by the way, on the Bio-PsyWar, because the Bio-PsyWar is very psychological. Now we're covering a lot of the nuts and bolts stuff. We're covering a lot of the actual biological weapons, because I've kind of made a claim, and I'm backing it up with a lot of backstory and context and detail here, and we'll go over that here in a sec. But from the creature of control, you should be able to, if I did this properly, I'll do it now. We'll do it live. And we'll link the Bio-PsyWar underneath the creature. And then I haven't populated everything, but I'm going to start putting all the links and references on the left, and then we'll have more context built out on the bottom here, and then add into this. I'm just making you aware that that exists. Also, I need to have like some kind of sound effect that goes along with my corrections, because we have another exciting correction. That's what I got for now. Last week I was kind of, just parhesioing, ranting on, and there was I said, you should go check out Dave McGowan's book, Stranger Things. So I totally mixing. Now you should check out Stranger Things as well. That's an interesting series. But Dave McGowan's book is called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. And now, on the top of my head, I can't remember what we were bringing that up for, but I didn't want to correct myself. I also had this book floating around somewhere at one point, and I think it's one of those books that somebody borrowed, and it's never been seen again. So there we go. I've made the correction. Wasn't that big of a deal. Now let's go on a little bit of a rant before we go into the rest of the episode here. No, really, just covering more of my show notes and going into the Bio-PsyWar, which I've sat idly by and kind of watched and learned and tried to figure out exactly what was going on since late 2019, when I was first hearing about the coronavirus outbreak in China, and I was starting to get tricklings of information about what was going on. I had, at that point, was very kind of, concerned, obviously, about mainly what I was talking about back then was people's reaction to the news and information, and how they would, most likely hype it up into a situation that was overblown. And I was hearing from others this sort of thing right around that time of December 2019. And so, once the information started coming out, it wasn't a surprise, but I wasn't sure myself how to take it. Like, I wasn't, should I be in a full body latex suit? Should I be wearing goggles? Should I be wearing a mask? Should I not go? Should I try to go out shopping late at night when no one else is around? Like, I didn't know for sure, and I still don't have 100% of the answers of what somebody's reaction to the situation should be. And I think we're even getting a lot of mixed information about that as far as that goes. But what I have noticed is, obviously there's the people that aren't going to think, don't want to think, probably never will think for themselves, and are just going to listen to the experts, listen to the scientists, listen to the medical establishment, and they're not going to question the narrative, even if the narrative itself is contradictory and confusing. For them, it's much easier to just listen and believe whatever the mainstream narrative is. There's that camp of people. Now, then there's the other camp of people who reject everything the mainstream says and won't, ever believe anything the mainstream media or like the general narrative on things, or what they might see as more of like the control grid, saying what the story should be. They're not going to believe that at all. Now, I'm more in agreement with we shouldn't believe known liars, and we should always question people who, especially people who are known to lie to us. On the other hand, we have to be careful not to just call things a conspiracy completely and say that it's not real and it's not going on and there's nothing happening, and then, not do any further questioning and research either, and just assume that we've always got it all figured out, and then there's no, anybody that's just believing the mainstream is a total idiot, and I've got it all figured out because I think it's all a hoax and it's all bullshit and it's all just the flu, man, and there's nothing else going on, And I think that's largely problematic. I think that if you're not willing to accept that there's a mixture, a hybrid of the Bio-PsyWar, it's biological and psychological. It's both. There's not just one component. That's more getting into where I'm coming from with this series is there has been, biological agents, environmental toxins, and environmental conditions that have changed that are making people sick, and that is not only possible to be done by terrorists or non-state actors, but also state actors and, I repeat myself, the state terrorist actors, who that's where I think is what's going on here, is a little bit of getting out in front of what was seen to be an impending threat, things that have already gone on, or where, terrorist organizations could get a hold of anthrax or other biological weapons that the U.S. military creates, and, intentionally spread them throughout subway systems, spray them off the coast of San Francisco, release them in the wild, and unknown results could occur, right? And all the things I just explained, by the way, are things that are well documented that the U.S. military has done in an effort to, again, get out in front of the research and out in front of the results and the reaction, so that you can then have more control over those conditions. So, if I'm talking to a friend and I believe everything the mainstream media says about what's going on, and I just listen to Lord Fauci and Lord Gates, and whatever they say is how I roll and how I think. If I'm talking to someone like that and I'm trying to explain, that it's possible that this thing has been modified in a lab and created as a weapon, as a biological weapon, and that could be done in the name of vaccine research or defense research, or just scientific research to be able to see, what would happen if this virus developed and jumped into humans like this. So that's one place to start, okay? And that's okay to open that door. But then you need to add more context, or at least that's what I would like to do. So a big part of what we're doing here is going into that research. And again, I think it's a big mistake to just be like, it's just a big hoax, there's nothing going on. And then the people that kind of cheer that on too, like, yeah, man, I don't need to be wearing masks, bro. And like, what I think is funny is like, and I don't think this is funny in a funny way. I think it's funny in like a sick and psychotic and crazy way, but that, in 5 years, we all might be wearing latex suits. Like, like you could go look up and see like who are the people investing in latex and plastic, like suit materials and things. Because, I'm laughing, but we're making fun of the mask wearers. But if you kind of get into some of the stuff that I'm looking at on the other side with like what they're actually doing and what they're saying they're doing in their own documents, like a rational person might actually then be wearing like a full body suit and be walking around. So like, I'm just waiting for that to be kick on. Like I may go invest in these companies that are going to be making the full body latex suits. Again, laughing out of disgust and feeling like there's no other way to not show apathy, and because I don't want to get angry, on live on the air, although I may someday. But for now, the laughter is not thinking that that's really funny, but just more or less like, oh, there's nothing going on, man. It's totally bullshit. The government's always lying to us. It's like saying like, well, yeah, so yeah, there's some things on 9/11 that we didn't know about, but so it's all bullshit. Like, so it didn't happen. Like, is that, and that's kind of the argument with that. I feel like it's sort of being in shock about the situation and like calling, like you're kind of like taking a gamble, like, oh, well, they've lied about so much before. Like, this is all just bullshit, man, and like, you don't really know. You've not looked into it enough, apparently, because there's a lot of this that is very real that is part of the Bio-PsyWar. So there's a little bit of that rant. Again, just touching on the double-edged nature of the research, the dual-use dilemma, the double-edged innovations and developments become problematic because as soon as you uncover something in the lab about how you could make SARS more virulent and more spreadable, or make H1N1 virus aerosolized, and you think that that's good for your vaccine research, which, again, when we go back and really uncover what vaccine research is, it's just weapons research. Again, it's another way to pass and spread viruses amongst the human population. But we'll leave that there for now and assume that it's all done in the name of health and science and truth and goodness. There's many problems with the other side of that and how easily that research could be weaponized. And that you could say, well, I'm researching, free energy for all. And that ends up becoming like some bomb that blows up the entire planet. But you were, or like Tesla and his energy research, he had made an oscillator that, apparently shook the foundations of buildings in some of his tests and could have been used to bring down buildings. And imagine the shock and horror that he thought about as he saw his research being taken from him, and his best years, where he should have been held up and cheered as one of the greatest minds of humanity, was spent, watching his research being taken away and no accolades, nobody putting his name in the history books and holding him up as one of the greatest minds. And now, most likely all of his research was weaponized and is being used in ways that is only to keep this whole thing going, with the military's ever ongoing experimenting and testing, which really at this point is just part of the New World Order control grid, is a militarized technocracy, cybernetic control grid. Now, further down, what we're going to do here today is cover and so again, there's always the stories about vaccine research, and then there's the what about the Russians thing, and then there's the what about nature argument, as far as the justifications. If you go back and watched double-edged developments, the opening 20 minutes of Fauci justifying that, well, I don't think most people would be opposed to us researching this type of gain-of-function research, right? So let's cover some of the articles that we've highlighted over the course of the Bio-PsyWar. And first, I just want to highlight these. This is more to just kind of back up the argument again that the most evidence that we have seems to point to the fact that, Fort Detrick, Maryland, other arms and entities and apparatuses of the U.S. government are heavily interested and involved in the NIH and the NIAID, and Fauci's research organizations are heavily interested in funding synthetic biological weapons research. And here, this article from The Guardian, was talking about how synthetic biology raises risk of new bioweapons. U.S. report warns. This was from June of 2019, and it's a short article. The rapid rise of synthetic biology, a futuristic field of science that seeks to master the machinery of life, has raised the risk of a new generation of bioweapons, according to a major U.S. report into the state of the art. Advances in the area mean that scientists now have the capability to recreate dangerous viruses from scratch, make harmful bacteria more deadly, and modify common microbes so that they churn out lethal toxins once they enter the body. So again, I'm not really looking to read the whole article, but let's just read the bottom. It says, one bioweapon that is not considered an immediate threat is a so-called gene drive that spreads through a population, rewriting human DNA as it goes. Quote, it's important to recognize that it's easy to come up with a scary-sounding idea, but it's far more difficult to do something practical with it, unquote, said Carr. All right, so that will be in the show notes. And I'm just now kind of going over some of these articles. This one here, synthetic recombinant bat SARS-like coronavirus, is infectious in cultured cells and in mice. That's one that you have to print out. And I did print that out here. And I'm just going to put this one in the show notes. But again, this is from 2008, where they're talking about, making SARS-like coronaviruses that infected cultured cells in mice. All the way back in 2008. And I don't specifically have something I want to read out of that, but I'm just kind of going over some of the evidence here. So there's 2008, them messing with SARS-like coronaviruses in the lab. Here's an article from The Scientist, Moratorium of Gain-of-Function Research. That was up behind a paywall, so I pulled it up over here. This article is from 2014. And just a highlighted section of that article here. Oh, whoops, I'm on the wrong screen, sorry. Over here you can see that article, and it wants me to log in, so I've just pulled it up on Pocket here, and we'll just read a little bit of that. It says, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, and Department of Health and Human Services last week, October 17th, announced it was launching a detailed review into so-called gain-of-function research, in which pathogens are manipulated to alter their capabilities. Such research made headlines in 2012 after two groups instilled the avian influenza virus, H5N1, with the ability to transmit between ferrets through the air, a feat that prompted a year-long moratorium on H5N1 research. Now, in the face of threats like influenza, SARS, and MERS, which have killed scores in the Middle East and Asia, the government is insisting to pause gain-of-function funding for experiments involved in these deadly viruses. And then it says, quote, the NIH has funded such studies because they help define the fundamental nature of human pathogen interactions, enable the assessment of the pandemic potential of emerging infectious agents, and inform public health and preparedness efforts, unquote. National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins said in a statement, quote, these studies, however, also entail biosafety and biosecurity risks, which need to be better or understood better, unquote. And so you can go, there's not much more to that article. I'll put that in the show notes. So again, they're always like, yeah, well, it's all right, it's all good if we're doing the research, and there's no problem with that. And then you look, and several years later, there's massive pandemics involving the stuff that they were gain of functioning in the labs, and were shut down several times for biosafety concerns, and they're talking about it right out in the open that they're doing these things and saying it's worth it to do it. Well, looking back now, would you tend to still agree with that? Or, if we look more into the AIDS virus, HIV, we're going to go into that here in the Bio-PsyWar. It might not all be continuously a series that we just continue on. I may start to mix in some other themes here. But as far as the Bio-PsyWar series, I figure we're going to be in that until the whole planet is basically walking around in latex suits, and then at that point, the new normal will be so normalized that we won't need to go into the Bio-PsyWar, because, you'll be born in a suit and living in the Walmarts, All right, we'll leave it there for now. Going back and just touching on these articles that I've covered in the Bio-PsyWar so far, but just kind of to reiterate, and they re-go over our point. In 2019, the Fort Detrick lab shut down after failed safety inspection. All research halted indefinitely. All research at Fort Detrick Laboratory that handles high-level disease-causing materials such as Ebola is on hold indefinitely after the Center of Disease Control and Prevention found the organization failed to meet biosafety standards. No infectious pathogens or disease-causing material have been found outside the authorized areas at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease. So, again, you can go see that they were shut down because of safety concerns back in August 2nd of 2019. Next, a biosecurity failure. This is a more in-depth article. For the past 50 years, the nation's leading biodefense, this is from thejournal.org, and let's just see if I had something highlighted in here specifically to read, or if we were just more pointing at it for further things that you can go read about the history of these shutdowns and various lab outbreaks or safety concerns that have occurred, not in Wuhan and not anywhere else in the world, but here in the United States, from our military and our NIH and I'm only saying our because I live on the continent, but not because I'm part of some kind of club. And then we have here the independent.co.uk back in, let's see, when was this article written? I think I've had this problem before with this article. They don't clearly have it, or I'm looking too fast. On October of 2018. And it says the U.S. military's plan to spread viruses using insects could create a new class of biological weapons, scientists warn. And we'll learn more about why the bugs, but insects could be turned into a new class of biological weapons using the U.S. military plans, experts have warned. The Insect Allies program, and we've learned about that before in the Bio-PsyWar from DARPA, and their insect allies. It looks like there's another good article from the Independent on that. But basically, weaponizing bugs to save the plants. That's why they're doing it, not to spread vaccinations or anything like that around, or mRNA gene altering materials into the environment that could easily then be spread around by these insects. But yeah, so we see jumping down here in that article from the Independent in 2018, they also noted that despite DARPA stating that no insects used should survive longer than 2 weeks, if such safeguards were not in place, quote, the spread could in principle be unlimited, unquote. Well, what if they reproduce? I mean, come on now. What about these ticks that we've been reading about? Are they also meant to only last a certain amount of time? We seem to have finding connections that show otherwise. One article that's article is good enough for now, and then I'll link the other one that I opened here if I can remember to in the show notes, and we'll get to the next one. But I almost forgot one. This one's very important. This is from The Lancet in 2003, September 2003. And it says, will influenza, this text is a little small, so bear with me here. It says, will influenza be the next bioweapon? And it starts out, the use of influenza as a bioterrorist weapon is a clear and present danger, warns Mohammed Madij, University of Texas Health and Science Center, Houston, Texas, USA. Quote, our work on the effects of influenza on cardiovascular mortality shows that many people die from influenza-related myocardial infarction, which is not reported as influenza mortality. Thus, mortality due to influenza in the U.S. alone is much more than previously estimated, probably 90,000 annually, rather than the reported 20,000, once the effect on the heart is taken into account, unquote. Now I'm going to skip down, skip this paragraph, although you should read the entire article. Here, I'll get myself out of the way and zoom in a little bit more, and I'm going to skip down to this part here, which says, critics say that it would be hard to create an influenza strain that is virulent enough to pose a significant threat, but, counters Klaus Stauer, Project leader of the sorry, the text is a little small here and I'm a little far away. Project leader of the WHO's global influenza program, the quote, the tools to create a virulent strain are readily available, unquote, with reverse genetics, the same technology that was used to construct a vaccine against the H5N1 influenza strain, from the Drug and Discovery Today 2003, pages 518 and 519. Quote, we can readily produce the surface proteins and other proteins needed to assemble viruses on demand, he says. Quote, we could reproduce the 1918 virus or develop one that is completely new, put it together with other proteins necessary for the virus to function, and then release it. Starr would prefer to use the reverse genetics and other technologies to develop cross-subtype specific vaccines. We have the hemagglutinin genes H1 and H15, and we should have vaccines that protect against H1 and H15. So again, you could read more about this. Let's see, it says, skipping down here, I'm just going to read this section as well. Governments can also prepare, added Medij and colleagues, by providing better security for laboratories, vaccine manufacturers, and distributors, improve influenza immunization programs, expanded disease surveillance, and use the antiviral filters, biosensors, and inactivation mechanisms for ventilation systems. Stockpiling antivirals would also help. So again, I wanted to get in there for there's more context later coming up on that. But skipping ahead in the essence of time, that's an important one. That'll be in the show notes. You can definitely go check that out. That's from The Lancet in 2003. Now back to the screen here. We're going to talk about the ever important and seemingly one of the better articles that have come out in some time on this topic, and much praise and all credit obviously going to those over at The Last American Vagabond, specifically Whitney Webb in this case, although really appreciate Ryan for coming on the Grand Theft World last week. You can check that out. Actually, it's up now on the Grand Theft World YouTube channel. We've been allowed to publish back there again now. The gates have come up for our content to be released, and here you can see the interview from Ryan Christian
for these type of dynamics, and
a special guest on Grand Theft World number 18, and that's an excellent interview that you can go check out. He is the one who put together the Last American Vagabond blog and has organized the people that write on there. This article, again, bats, gene editing, and bioweapons. Recent DARPA experiments raise concern amid coronavirus outbreak. This is a key article. Definitely recommend going and reading through the whole thing. Just to read a little bit of it into the record here. DARPA recently spent millions on research involving bats and coronaviruses. This is from January 30th, 2020. As well as gene editing, quote, bioweapons, unquote, prior to the recent coronavirus outbreak. Now, quote, strategic allies, unquote, of the agency have been chosen to develop a genetic material-based vaccine to halt the potential epidemic. And there's lots of links, lots of resources and material that can be uncovered here. DARPA partnering with CEPI, and if you go look, they've also funded Moderna, as well as with Bill and Melinda Gates also funding Moderna back in 2019, which we uncovered in Grand Theft World podcast number 17 and found from a letter to the shareholders in 2019 from Moderna that they disclosed the funding from Bill and Melinda Gates and DARPA. I could pull that up now and do it live. It's well worth it. I mean, why not? What's the point of having this browser in front of me and doing it live if I'm not going to pull stuff up as I talk about it? So it's just I'm putting some strain with all the browsers and the bandwidth and the hamsters, you know, don't want to spin them too hard. So if I was right, that was Grand Theft World podcast number 17. Let's see how good we did at getting that link in the show notes. DARPA, Moderna, here we are, 2019 shareholder letter. And you can see this is from 2019, right, in Moderna. And if we go down, in the tiny, tiny print at the bottom, once we get there, you can see this reference. I'm going to accept everything they want to do to me first. And then I'm going to zoom way in so that the audience can see at the bottom it says from the cited reference number 1 at the top, where they're talking about their funding, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Additional funding is subject to agreement on scope of additional projects. So there you go. There's the funding that Moderna received in 2019 from the military and Bill and Melinda Gates, and now they're out there selling, they're getting their products into your arms that they developed. How lucky are they that they had the foresight? I mean, in 2019, wow, what kind of foresight to be able to see that this Moderna vaccine was going to be needed in 2020. Wow, what a novel and brilliant idea they had. I was trying to find where they actually cited that reference. Let me see. Let me just search the number 1, huh? That was not the way to go about it, apparently. Anyway, I'll let you go peruse through that and what the shareholders document is talking about. And, I mean, again, that is great foresight on their part, that the military, DARPA, BARDA, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation all knew that we were going to need this Moderna technology in 2020. It's just a tremendous, I mean, I guess the Lord works in mysterious ways, All right, so what else do we want to get through before we go into the bulk of the material today? The bulk. Everybody's like, wait, I thought we were in the bulk of the material. Yeah, so after that, we could read the conclusion from Whitney Webb's article. Research conducted by the Pentagon and DARPA specifically has continually raised concerns, not just in the field of bioweapons and biotechnology, but also in the field of nanotechnology, robotics, and several others. DARPA, for instance, has been developing a series of unsettling research projects that range from microchips that can create and delete memories from the human brain to voting machine software that is rife with problems. Now, as fear regarding the current coronavirus outbreak begins to peak, companies with direct ties to DARPA have been tasked with developing its vaccine, a long-term human and environmental impact of which are unknown and will remain unknown by the time the vaccine is expected to go to market in a few weeks' time. Furthermore, DARPA and the Pentagon's past history with bioweapons and their more recent experiments on genetic alteration and extinction technologies, as well as bats and coronaviruses in proximity to China, have been largely left out of the narrative, despite the information being publicly available. Also left out of the media narrative have been the direct ties of both the USA MRIID and DARPA-partnered Duke University in the city of Wuhan, including the Institute of Medical Virology. Though much about the origins of the coronavirus outbreak remains unknown, the U.S. military ties to the aforementioned research studies and research institutions are worth detailing, as such research, while justified in the name of, quote, national security, unquote, has the frightening potential to result in unintended yet world-altering consequences. The lack of transparency about this research, such as DARPA's decision to classify its controversial genetic extinction research and technologies used as a weapon of war, compounds these concerns. While it's important to avoid reckless speculation as a result of possible... let me start over with that sentence. While it is important to avoid reckless speculation as much as possible, it is the opinion of this author that the information in this report is in the public interest and that the reader should use the information to reach their own conclusions about the topics discussed herein. Very well said. And I think that if you read the article, it's hard to not draw certain conclusions. Now, if you followed the Bio-War series, it's also hard not to draw certain conclusions. But I try to leave my opinion out of it for the most part and just point you to the information that I feel like is helpful for you to go through yourself. And, I am kind of putting forth a theory and a thread that I'm pulling on. I'm willing to change my opinion and my ideas and thoughts as time goes on. I'm not like glued to the outcome of me proving that, my point. That was more or less a point I had come to long before. And now I'm doing the diligence to uncover more of the history and put the materials in front of not only myself but others, hopefully in a helpful way that, might get people to be able to think about things a little bit differently or see it a little bit differently. And we do it live to keep the sync up of being able to do it weekly without post-production, so I can be, more light with the production to just get it out onto the record, kind of like a live radio show. That in turn will hopefully over time increase my ability to just be succinct and to the point and get the show done. And as always, I've never really held myself to a standard of like, I have to do it every week and it's got to be I may take times off, 6 months, years. And for the most part, though, I want to create an archive on tylerblair.com where I will have, these things laid out to be able to point to reference. And I am going to build a page of like an archive list where somebody could just go and pull up my archive in one page, because I do recognize that although, of course, you could go see the latest post in the Bio-PsyWar right here on the front page, every sort of series I do has its own title, and you can go click that and find like that, or Falling into the Movement Traps, or my Walk and Talks, or Creature of Control, or Liberty Life. So everything's kind of done with the big picture. You can click it and go into it. But I'd like to also build an archive, just line by line. Here's all the shows in one page. People can go easily pull up and see what it's about and a brief summary and click on it. And so that's coming. And again, in the long run, that'll put out a picture of the story I've been trying to tell, the tapestry I've been trying to weave in these different areas, so that while I'm talking out there to your average basic dipshit, I can share, the information with them in a way that makes sense, and they can see that I'm coming at it from, someone who's put in a lot of time and effort to try to, get the information out, and not necessarily just like fly-by-night meme posting on social media trying to like make you look bad with your opinion. Taking more time to go into the information here. And also I archive the shows on an audio version, so people can go listen to the audio archives while they're out and about in an easy way with their favorite podcast application. And over time, the audio archive might become more valuable than this kind of video show. And depending on how people like to consume things, I know I personally like when a content creator also makes the audio archive easily available. All right, so moving forward with today's episode, the other few more things that we just need to cover that we've covered in the past, just to kind of tie the knot, would be the House of Representatives orders Pentagon to investigate whether ticks were once used as biological weapons in July 17th of 2019. That's a CNN Politics article. We also had the Guardian, House orders Pentagon to review. Same thing, same story from July of 2019. As we saw from the interview with Ricky Varandas and Chris Newby last week that I played a large portion of that into the show, that was dismissed. They aren't going to be looking at this, and they've got too many other things going on, apparently. This is not important to them to look into, but it was brought up in the House, and that's interesting. So they were trying to order the Pentagon to review this history of ticks being used as a bioweapon, and CNN also covered that. I would play this clip here, but they'll probably then claim that I'm using their copywritten material or something. And then we have forget about from the Guardian, support the Guardian from the Guardian back in January 25th of 2018, we had an article here that says, "Forget Ebola, SARS, and Zika. Ticks are the next global health threat. Ticks carry a wide array of pathogens and environmental changes mean they are spreading." I'm assuming that they're saying that ticks are spreading because of the environmental changes. So it's probably carbon dioxide that's feeding the ticks. That's what's causing them to grow more. But I'm not really going to look through this whole article. This is an interesting article, but rather just to show, that I'm not totally off base, and neither is Chris Newby here with our claims about, or not our claims, with looking into what's going on now as being a potential lab created or government test or militarized live test that has gone on, or intentional release of a biological weapons agent, along with the whole Great Reset agenda and global takeover of everything and global communism, neo-communism 2.0, things like that. It's not crazy to go and research this stuff, because clearly, there are people even, in the House writing these articles going into the dangers of what I've been discussing here in the show, and that's mainly what we've been trying to go over. And in fact, here's Willy Bergdorfer here, the guy that we've been learning about, who the Swiss scientist who was imported into America hired to do biological weapons research with ticks. And he says here in his own writing, "Dear Dale," this is sent to the entomology division at Fort Detrick, "enclosed are 3 copies of the final report on EJ. We intended to write it up before Christmas, but the season's rush finally prevented getting it done. Today I chatted with Dr. E. Oliver, who arrived here yesterday. Since he shows a great interest in artificial feeding techniques of ticks, I suggested a practice session in glass capillary feeding and injecting techniques tomorrow morning. Although we are still very busy with setting up necessary equipment of fluorescent microscopy, we already are outlining our field studies on Colorado tick fever for the coming tick season. In addition, we are running various experiments on simultaneous infections of Dermacentor Ardenssonia with Colorado tick fever and Rickettsia rickettii organisms. It will be of interest to see whether there actually exist in interference between these 2 agents." So he's happy about his research, but he's talking about injecting viruses and making ticks into bioweapons in this letter, essentially. And that's the researcher himself admitting that that's what he was doing, with Colorado tick fever. So not that we haven't talked about that already. I just thought that was an interesting article I found on Chris Newby's site. And then later we're going to go into this Spirochetes Warfare by Ellen Cook. But we are going to now get into the book that we started to go into last week and ran out of time. And I definitely want to make the time for it today. So let's just jump into it now before I get too long-winded. If I can find it. Where did I put it here? All right. Now... I'm not sure how I would lose the book in the mix here, but I got too many other books stacked on top of it. There's Bitten, A Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Chris Newby. We read the back cover, we read the sleeves last week, we read a few quotes out of the book. Today, we're going to go way more in depth into the book. So, we're going to do some reading today, kids, and we're going to do that a lot on this show. So if you don't like reading, well, that's why I'm doing it for you. Because I can read the books, right? I'll take the time to read the books. I'll take the time to find the interesting parts. I can take the time to read it into the record, thus, helping remove your excuses for not being aware of the information. And then not being able to say, like, well, I've never heard of that. We can make that more easy for you. We can read the books. I can take the time to collect the research and attempt to do a good job at reading it into the record. So again, we're reading. I just need to check something here, so I'm kind of filling the space telling you about me checking something as I check it, because there was something that I skipped. So we're going to get to this, but I want to get back to really quick reading from pages 18 through 23 in the last book. We also read about Plum Island and Lab 257 in the last episode of Tick-Tok Bio-Op Part 1. Here in Tick-Tok Bio-Op Part 2, there's more that we should go into regarding that. And these are the pages that we read last time. I'm going to skip ahead to page 18 in Lab 257. And reading from the section on Lime Island. And yeah, this is a bit of a longer section, so just bear with me as we read this into the record from Lab 257 here in the Bio-PsyWar Tick-Tok Bio-Op Part 2. By 1990, the East End Long Island had by leaps and bounds the largest incidence of Lyme disease in the nation. But why? The geography, you can pinpoint cases of Lyme disease on the map of the United States by drawing a circle around the area of largest infection. Now you can tighten that circle into a small point until a single small point is reached. That point, Plum Island. Spokes radiate outward from that point and pass through the neighborhoods boasting the highest rates of Lyme disease containment in the nation. The vectors in the 1950s, the cocking of rifle was the often heard on Plum Island, portending the demise of deer that swam from the mainland to the forage. Over time, fewer rifle shots were heard as the number of deer swimming to and fro increased, collecting ticks along the way. While each deer were periodically shot, there was no stopping the wild birds. Retired scientists Jim and Carol House have been birding on Plum Island for over 20 years now, never missing an Audubon Society Christmas bird count, where they scout the terrain with binoculars, scribbling notes and snapping pictures. Quote, Plum Island has a unique bird life, unquote, says Jim House. It's not, quote, it's got purple sandpipers, harlequin ducks, robins, eiders, osprey, wobblers, and woodcocks, unquote, says Carol. Plum even hosts the golden and bald eagles, who come in and dine on the baby Canadian geese. Quote, it's one of their favorite stops in the springtime, unquote. There's no short supply of bald eagles found because massive flocks of Canadian geese rule the island in droves. Quote, we call them the Canadian Air Force, unquote, says one worker. Quote, we made a list of 140 different species, unquote, said Carol. Quote, one time I counted over 200 brown creepers, unquote. The American Museum of National History runs a wild bird colony. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. That's fine. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Plum Island, breeders of Canadian geese. Okay, that's fine. I'm still going to skip to this part. And it says, let's face it, Plum Island scientist Dr. Douglas Gregg Reese said to a reporter, quote, there can be no absolute guarantee of securing the island, unquote. Wait, did I not just read? Okay, yeah. The theories, attempts by the scientific community to explain the origins of Lyme disease are far more convincing. One popular theory holds that ticks always had BB bacteria germs, similar to BB, existed in Europe and Asia for 300 years, and infections are the result of human-altered habits, which in which the pests live. So this person is giving the mainstream argument is much more convincing. A century ago goes the theory that there were far fewer woods in the United States and deer near extinct. Because of the modern conservation movements, forests replaced farmlands and populations of deer, birds, and small animals surged. In this environment, ticks multiplied. Suburban developments did the same. As Dr. Ralph Terno reasons, quote, by the mid-1970s, human beings' collective behavior had created circumstances so that favored the spread of Lyme disease, that sooner or later it was bound to attract people's notice and demand a protective response. We made our own sickbed, and now we have to lie in it, unquote. So that's like the theory that it's just a natural-born illness and that it's our fault for the way that we've treated the environment. This theory assumes that Lyme disease was a gradual problem that attracted attention. Nothing is further from the truth. What occurred in Old Lyme in 1975 was the outbreak of an unknown illness concentrated within a defined geographical location that infected 39 children and 12 adults, and was a modest epidemic. Old Lyme's outbreak was the footprint of something that had deposited itself there and festered. Lyme disease cannot simply be ascribed to poor land and use patterns. When 10 miles south of Old Lyme lies the untamed island, teeming with ticks, birds, deers, and mice, hosting 2 high-hazard germ laboratories proven to be anything but reliable in containing foreign germs. White-tailed deer often swim across Plum Gut, and 2 miles wide strait that separates Plum Island from Long Island. Countless birds, including seagulls, Canadian geese, and osprey, fly between the coastal Connecticut, Long Island, and Plum Island. Old Lyme lies directly in the flight vector of birds that congregate on Plum Island and migrate north and south along the east coast. When biological security was taken seriously in the early 1950s, deer were shot on sight when trained snipers. Even puppies and dogs, fatefully setting their paws on the island's beaches with their owners, would be euthanized. By 1975, germs on Plum Island increased in both numbers and virulence, but safety and security measures moved in the opposite direction. Tests were supposed to be held in airtight laboratory rooms. Instead, internal government documents proved there was gaping holes in the lab roof where the air currents and insects freely came and went, depending upon the direction of the wind. What's more, the animals were held in outdoor pens where they were injected with virus vaccines and fed out of open-air feeding troughs. Plum Island workers witnessed birds flying in and out of the pens, picking morsels from the troughs. Wild animals were shooed away, but not before the birds swooped down and mingled with the test animals. One eyewitness reported seeing deer entering the animal pens to feed. If Dr. Traub continued his outdoor germ experiments with the Army and experimented with ticks outdoors, the ticks would have made contact with mice, deer, and more than 140 species of wild birds known to frequent the nest on Plum Island. The birds spread their toxic cargo to resting and nesting perches atop the great elms of the oaks of Old Lyme and elsewhere. Just like the other spread of West Nile virus through the United States, researchers trying to prove that Lyme disease existed before 1975 claim to have isolated BB in ticks collected nearby Shelter Island and Long Island in the late 1940s. That timing coincides with both Eric Traub's arrival in the United States on Project Paperclip and the Army's selection of Plum Island as its offshore biological warfare laboratory. The USDA spokesperson Sandy Miller says Hayes is unconvinced about the possibility of the link between Lyme disease and Plum Island. She says, so that person is that not convinced, and then I think she says here, Lyme disease, Lyme disease, the positive agent for Lyme disease was identified in 1948, which was about 6 years before Plum Island came into being. So then some people blame the Army There is a part of me that says, quote, let's get this straight. The U.S. Army that had saved the world came along after World War and said, let's poison a bunch of ticks and turn them loose on the people in Connecticut, unquote. We kind of giggled around here about the stories, but some of them are just outlandish. I always laugh about Nazi scientists. Do you want to hear about how scientists are keeping a cow from drooling, or do you want to hear about poisoned ticks and the Nazi scientists? It's always more fun to tell the scary stories. And that's the end of that section. And moving on Lab 257, we're just reading a small excerpt from the book here on page 22 now, about Plum Island and Traub and the ticks and the biological weapons research that was happening there and some of the safety concerns. A PR expert, Hayes, had Scientific America eating out of her hands in June of 2000 when they reported her saying, well, we still get asked about the Nazi scientists. The slightest trace of weariness creeping into her voice. In their feature story on Plum Island, the prestigious magazine dubbed the intriguing surroundings the island as a, quote, fanciful, fictional tapestry, unquote. But as much as Mr. Hayes and the Scientific American might like to laugh or shrug it off, hard facts are indeed facts. The Army and the USDA conducted numerous outdoor biological warfare experiments within United States borders. The Army and the USDA were cooperating in a germ warfare laboratory built on Plum Island. The U.S. recruited the key architects of Nazi Germany germ warfare programs who worked directly for Heinrich Himmler. After Fort Detrick and the CIA interrogated him, the Nazi scientists developed the idea to build Plum Island, modeled after their own germ warfare lab on Insel Reims. The USDA borrowed this Nazi scientist to work in its Washington, D.C. area laboratories, and the very Nazi scientists who now confirmed to have been on Plum Island at least 3 occasions, there aren't, quote, fictional tapestries, unquote, or, quote, scary movies, unquote. There are scary facts from which conclusions can be shown to be drawn. Can and should be drawn, sorry. While the Army and the USDA are quick to deny the Plum Island tick experiments ever occurred, every few years the public learns of a top-secret germs warfare test whose existence in the U.S. government had long been denied. Consider the 2002 Pentagon disclosure in the New York Times about the 1964 test. The Defense Department sprayed live nerve and biological agents on ships and sailors in the Cold War era experiments to test the naval vulnerability to toxic warfare, the Pentagon said today. 6 tests were carried out. Hundreds of sailors were exposed to poisons in some of the experiments known as Project Shipboard Hazard or SHAD. Of the 6 tests, 3 used sarin, a nerve gas, or VX, a nerve gas agent used in Iraq by Saddam Hussein against its own people. I wonder where he got that. 1 used staphylococcal exteriotoxin B, known as SEB, a biological toxin. 1 used a simulant Serrateov muscarsins, believed to be harmless but subsequently found to be dangerous. 4,300 military personnel were identified as participants in Project SHAD. Well, those are, at least they volunteered for that position voluntarily. All right, so as we can see here, that book continues on, and there's definitely more interesting material to be gone into. But we are going to leave Lab 257 for now, and we are going to get back into that again at some point in the future. And now, finally, we're going to be getting into Bitten, and I'm not going to poke around or go anywhere else. I'm just going to get into it, because I've been saying we're going to get into it, and somehow we keep not getting into it. So, I have lots of sections picked out here. I'm going to be hopping around. Bear with me as I do, but I'm going to be reading a few excerpts from the book Bitten. Here we are on Confession, the chapter, page 102, and it says here, I turned off my TV screen and sat in the dark. I was stunned. Based on what I had just seen on the video, I believed that Willie was telling the truth. a truth that had been eating away at his soul for more than 30 years. Gray had sent me the video because he wanted to help me with his investigation. I hesitated. This is Chris Newby, narrating the book, as she had Lyme disease and was doing the research to write the book. I hesitated. I had battled Lyme disease for 7 years and had been symptom-free for 3. And while I was recovering, I had spent 3.5 years working on the Lyme disease documentary. Now I wanted to move on. I had a great job writing about the latest advances in medical research at Stanford University. My kids were almost finished with college. Let someone else carry this torch. I needed boring, safe normalcy. Still, I felt a nagging guilt that the documentary had missed its mark. And if Willie's claim was true, a crime against humanity had been committed by the U.S. government and then covered up. If the full story weren't told, millions more Lyme patients would suffer. Somebody needs to dig out the truth, and I figured that somebody was me. Okay, I'm going to switch back here to pages 25 to 27. And just again, Willy Bergdorfer was thought, he was doing a good thing. He was a man who was doing research on something that he was passionate about, and that ended up being used as biological weapons research, and his legacy was then classified. All the discoveries and things that he thought he was making along the way were weaponized, and we can go into what his intentions were, but he himself, as was pointed out in the last episode, did not say that Lyme disease was caused by weaponized ticks, and he did not make that link himself and did not say, hey, I admit that Lyme disease was caused by weaponized ticks. But he did admit to weaponizing ticks, and maybe once we uncover more about the nature of Lyme disease, we could understand more. But going here, we're on page 24 and 25. We're going to read a section here. Willie's academic advisor, Rudolf Geige, was born in 1902 to an upper wealthy class family that founded what would become J.R. Geige's AG, a chemical company that started as a family business in 1758. The company's Basel headquarters were on the Rhine River in the regions where the borders of Switzerland, France, and Germany met. During World War II, the company was perfectly situated to sell goods to both the Allies and Germany. The original Geige company started off as a textile dye manufacturer and then moved into chemicals. During the war, it produced insecticides and most notably the iconic polar red dye that colored the background of the Nazi swastika flag. Early in life, Geige opted for the adventure and jungle helmer over the traditional positions in the family firm. With the help of his family wealth, he had dedicated his life to minimizing the human toil of tropical diseases, many of which were transmitted by arthropods. To support the mission, he established the Swiss Tropical Institute Field Laboratory of Tanganyika, part of present-day Tanzania. In 1949, the center Seuss and Rikers scientists in Côte d'Ivoire in 1951. Even during war, his citizenship in neutral countries established him to travel freely. Quote, "The Swiss are above suspicion," unquote, said Geige, who later in life wore a thinly fictionalized novella, Siri Top Secret, that described the spy's activities he observed during his travels. It's not known if Geige participated in these activities, but he did help place young researchers in institutions that supported the U.S. bioweapons program. All right, we're going to skip ahead in Chris Newby's book, Bitten. Okay, so for the next few hours, Cincinnati's team rode around the subway system carrying bacterial sniffers disguised as briefcases and purses. Cincinnati's photographic light meter was actually a device that tracked temperatures and humidity. At the end of the day, one of the sensors at the 23rd Street stations showed calculated respiratory exposure to be 100,000 spores to a breath of 5 minutes after the light bulbs broke. By June 10th, 1 million New Yorkers were catching spores in the wet warmth of their lungs, unquote, and Cincinnati had Had it been anthrax in the light bulbs, the spores would have put New Yorkers out of commission. So this is talking about one of the experiments that the CIA did, breaking light bulbs in the subway systems to see how it would spread out with Bacillus subtilis. So this was one of many of open-air tests conducted in the 1960s and 70s by the CIA, the U.S. Army, and the Department of Defense. The coastal tests were conducted by personnel in Project Shipboard Hazard and Defense, SHAD, who sprayed simulated live biological chemical agents over the North Atlantic Pacific Oceans near the Marshall Islands, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and California coast. Land-based tests took place domestically in Alaska, Hawaii, Maryland, Florida, Utah, and Georgia, and internationally in Panama, Canada, and the United Kingdom. In 1964 and 1965, they used Bacillus subtilis to simulate a physical characteristics of the smallpox virus in airborne tests in Washington, D.C. National Airport and Greyhound bus terminal. Some of these human experiments were revealed through the Senate in 1976 Church Committee report, an independent Church of Scientology investigation, and a 2003 class action lawsuit filed against the U.S. government on behalf of the test subjects and veterans involved in SHAD projects. But a few of these open-air tests are still classified. The records have been destroyed, or the details of the operations were never put in writing. So, talking again, we just read about that in Lab 257. So that was just talking about that Operation SHAD and the military tests that were done. Now, those dudes and gals probably had no idea that that's what was going on, and they're just like cruising along on their ship journey, doing their thing. And the Navy is spraying chemical weapons on them to test out the reactions that probably severely injured a lot of those people. And that kind of stuff still goes on with the vaccines and the tests, and it's more and more obfuscated to the soldiers who just think like that, they're sick for a number of other reasons when, psychologically you could make a determination that a lot of the people that end up killing themselves after serving on duty probably have, severe issues in the brain because of biological testing that had been done to them throughout their service in the military, their voluntary service. So on page 77 now, I'm going to read a section here. At Hackett's lab the next day, the men plotted out a research agenda that could be completed within 4 weeks. Knowing that his letters home would be opened and read by the communist-enrolled controlled government, Willie included nothing about the experiments when writing to Dale. An interview with Fort Detrick's Director of Biological Research, Dr. J.R. Goodloe, on February 16, 1962. However, suggests one possible research agenda, quote, research on the new agents has tended to concentrate on viral and rickettsial diseases, with major efforts directed at increased first-hand knowledge of their so-called, i.e. anthropod-borne viruses, unquote. The United States had also begun basic research on the genetic manipulation of microorganisms. In that same report, Goodloe added, quote, "Studies of bacterial genetics are also in progress, and the aim of transferring genetic determinants from one type of organism to another," unquote. The goal of the experiment was to make biological agents more virulent and resistant to antibodies. Willie's personal agenda was to learn everything he could about Rehakek's new method for mass-producing ricketsets and viruses in live tick tissue cells floating in flasks. Considered better than the old methods of growing these microbes in fertilized chicken eggs, Rehakek, sorry, I'm doing the worst job at pronouncing that word, had his own agenda at that name. He was rolling out with red carpet for Willie in hopes of getting a 6 to 12 month research fellowship at Rocky Mountain Lab. All right, so this week I'm not forgetting to put back my bookmarks. All right, now I'm jumping around a little here, and I know, but we're getting the parts of this book into the record that I wanted to, and so it might not be like totally drawing a line directly, but you gotta open up, and just hear what I'm saying in the longer picture with what I'm reading in these excerpts throughout. Let's see. So I definitely wanted to include this section, and this is from page 68, 69, and 70 from Bitten, from Chris Newby, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons. It was a fork in the road of Willie's career. For the previous 13 years, he had been the military's go-to expert for mass-producing disease agents inside live arthropods. But now, the military had switched to a more reliable method of growing the microbes in vats of soupy growth mediums or in live insect cells in flasks. These microbes could then be freeze-dried or mixed in liquid suspensions designed to be disseminated over large areas in bombs or sprayers. Realizing that he could no longer earn his living as a zookeeper of crawling things, Willie had decided he'd need to learn a new skill or he'd be out of a job. He revealed his feelings about this in a letter to Dale on June 25th of 1965. Am I capable of learning a new field, or shall I get old and discontent like the others at RML, Rocky Mountain Lab, who are waiting for their retirement? You know, as well as I do, Dally, that medical entomology is the thing of the past. I could always find a job in Europe over the tropics, but that would mean that we'd have to leave God's country, unquote. Advances in microbial genetics had opened up the potential of manipulating viruses and rickettsias to create more powerful weapons, both lethal and incapacitating. The perfect incapacitating agents was one that made a large percentage of the population moderately ill for weeks to months. The illness is caused would have to be hard to diagnose and treat, and under the best circumstances, the target population shouldn't even be aware that they have been dosed with a bioweapon. This would be made easier for invading vaccinated soldiers to take over cities and industrial infrastructure without much of a fight or destruction of property. Bioweapons researchers such as Willie knew that infecting large populations would require exposing people to agents for which they had no natural immunity, and to do this, researchers would have to import and to invent new microbes. They were, in essence, playing God, creating, quote, bacteriological freaks or mutants, unquote, by using chemical, radiation, ultraviolet light, and other agents, wrote modern investigative journalist pioneer Jack Anderson in a Washington Post column on August 27, 1965. Willie had already been conducting a trial and error style of genetic manipulation, in the same way that a corn farmer or a hog farmer selectively breeds strains that result in desired outcomes. He was growing microbes inside ticks and having the ticks feed on animals and then harvesting the microbes from the animals that exhibited the level of illness the military had requested. He was also simultaneously mixing bacteria and viruses inside of ticks, leveraging the virus's innate ability to manipulate bacterial genes in order to reproduce and thus accelerate the rate of mutations and desirable new bacterial traits. In 1966, Fort Detrick Biological Subcommittee Munitions Advisory Group put this emerging research at the top of its priorities, describing it as research in microbial genetic concerned with the aspects of transformation, transduction, and recombination, unquote. The administrators at Rocky Mountain Labs needed a share of this military funding to stay open, so they took on some of these projects, including the development of a Q fever incapacitating agent and preliminary research on the bioweapon potential of Rickettsia rickettsii and Rift Valley fever virus, virus, and 2 rickettsias that caused flea-borne and lice-borne typhus. Willie's homework assignment in London was to learn the latest techniques in mass-producing, viewing, and manipulating these very small, fuzzy microbes and bring these skills back to the Rocky Mountain lab. Okay, so that was from the chapter Special Operations, pages 69 through 71 in the book Bitten by Chris Newby. And we're going to skip ahead here to this chapter. Later in the video, Grade circled back to the topic. So this is talking about the video interview of Willie Bergdorfer and some of the things that were said in the interview. One of the interviews with him, there's a few later in life that he gave, and here's an excerpt from one of those interviews. Later in the video, Gray circled back to the topic and asked, quote, "If there's an emergence of a brand new epidemic that has the tenets of all those things that you put together, do you feel responsible for that?" Unquote. And then he answers, quote, "Yeah, it sounds like throughout the 38 years I may have ... The lab director telephoned me, quote, "This is the director, and so I got somebody here from the FBI. Will you come down and will you ask a few questions?" Exactly the same thing I could recall all these discussions, unquote, Willie said. Finally, after 3 hours and 14 minutes, Gray asked him the one question, the only question he really cared about, quote, "Was the pathogen that you found in the tick that Alan Steer, in parentheses the Lyme outbreak investigator, unparentheses, gave you the same pathogen or similar or generationally mutation of the one you published in the paper from 1952? In response, Willie crossed his arms defensively, took a deep breath, stared into the camera for 43 seconds, an eternity. Then he looked away, down and to the right. He appeared to be working through an internal debate. The left side of his mouth briefly curled up, as if he was thinking, "Ah, well." Then anger flashed across his face. "Yeah," he said, more in German than in English. It was a stunning admission from one of the world's foremost authorities on Lyme disease. If it were true, it meant that Willie had left out essential data from his scientific articles on Lyme disease outbreak, and that as the disease spread like wildfire in the Northeast and Great Lakes regions in the United States, he was part of the cover-up of the truth. He seemed to be saying that Lyme disease wasn't naturally occurring germ, one that may have gotten loose and been spread by global warming, an explosion of deer, and other environmental changes. It had been created in a military bioweapons lab for specific purposes of harming human beings, and somehow it had gotten out. At the end of the interview, Gray grilled him for almost 4 hours. Willie wiped tears from his eyes. With that one word, confession, he had opened the door to a possible explanation for the complexities of Lyme that had eluded activists, journalists, and physicians and scientists for more than 30 years. Gray turned off one of the cameras, but not the other one, and began packing up the gear with his assistant. In the half-light of the fading summer day, the second camera shows Willie as he stares off into some invisible point in the distance. His face sags. A wind chimes outside of the window, and he lifts his head. Quote, "The winds are blowing out of the canyons," unquote, he says, looking out the window toward the jagged, sawtooth range of the Bitterroot Mountains. Then the video cuts to black. And then we read this part about if Willie's claim was true, a crime against humanity had been committed by the U.S. government and then covered up. It was the full story. If the full story weren't told, millions of more Lyme patients would suffer. So that's the video clip that Chris Newby was sent by her research fellow. And we read more of the context. That's where we started when we started reading the book here. So we are going to jump ahead now to page 114 and 115, reading from Bitten by Chris Newby, a book that came out in 2019, I believe. And we'll just confirm that. Copyright 2019 by Chris Newby. So relatively recent book. And I'm going to read from page 114 to page 115. And we are about possibly halfway through our reading for today. You're watching the TylerBloyer.com Bio-PsyWar stream. And today we're on Bio-PsyWar Tick-Tok op. The Tick-Tokerations. The Tick-Toperation. The Tick-Tok Bio-op P2. And not the P2 that you might be thinking of, but part 2 of the 6-part series thus far. And today, last time we wanted to get into reading this book. Maybe you can kind of see why I've been kind of getting to the point where I have now, where I'm finally actually reading the book. We did need a little bit of contextual information. I am just kind of checking a few things in the production here to make sure that we're still online. Everything's looking good. Sorry guys, I'm not really into being able to read the questions today. Greetings, Stephanie. Thank you for chiming in. I appreciate your commentary and always your viewership. And just knowing that somebody's chatting there helps me know that the stream is still going. So I really appreciate that. Okay, so reading from the top of the book here. My voice is still doing, from the top of the page here, my voice is still doing okay today. So we will continue on. From page 114. I knew that this was the last interview I'd get with Willie before his Parkinson's disease robbed him of his ability to speak. My last chance to convince him to share his secrets. Since Gray interviewed 6 months ago, his health has degraded significantly. I took a few deep breaths to calm my nerves. Over the previous weeks, sorry, I'm adjusting my equipment. Over the previous weeks, I settled on an interview strategy that I thought might work. I would engage the scientific part of his brain in answering my 2 questions. Why the Lyme discovery files were missing from the National Archives, and why images of the organism labeled Swiss agent were located in the archive folders in the time frame where there would expect the Lyme spirochetes pictures to be. Could this mysterious Swiss agent, which has never been mentioned in any publications associated with the Lyme outbreak, also be a biological weapon? After a few warm-up questions, I started asking specifics about the ticks and the patent blood samples collected around the time of the discovery. He told me that in the late 1979, he had tested over 100 ticks from Shelter Island, located about 20 miles from the Lyme outbreak, and all about 2 had an unidentified Rickettsia species inside. It looked like Rickettsia montana, now called Rickettsia montanensis, under a microscope, a non-disease-causing cousin of the deadly Rickettsia rickettsii, but it was a different species. He said that similar Rickettsia had also been found in Lone Star ticks, and that there had been quite a bit of, quote, excitement, unquote, over the discovery. I kept asking Willie about the mysterious rickettsia, but his answers were garbled, and all I could glean from him was that he had stopped investigating it for reasons unknown. Now, so this is the last interview. This is from Newbie, I believe, interviewed him. I may be wrong about that, but we'll go with that for now until I can clarify. And continuing on page 115, you said that there had not... You say they're not looking for it anymore, I asked. They probably paid people off, he said. They are folks up there who have a way to enable that, unquote. Next, I showed Willie an unlabeled image of a microbe and asked him what it was. Quote, that is a Swiss agent, unquote, said Willie. I asked him a series of questions on the microbe, and he recited what seemed like a well-rehearsed lines. The Swiss agent is a Rickettsia montana-like organism found in the European sheep tick Exodes ricinus, and it doesn't cause disease in humans. Then I asked him why he brought samples of it from Switzerland back to his lab. He replied with a response that he often used when he seemed to know the answer, but wasn't going to divulge it. Question mark? He said. I shifted to discussing the research he'd supervised at the Naval Medical Research Unit 3, called NAMRU-3, in Cairo, Egypt, a facility that worked on tick and bioweapons-related research. I was doing things that the Nazis used to be doing, Willie said. What kind of stuff? Working on the suspension for fleas, determining how many of the quantity and genetic material in fleas can be used, unquote. Willie paused, unable to find the words to finish. Quote, so you're putting plague into fleas then? Unquote. Yeah, he said. What else were you doing? I asked. Page 116. Increasing the fertility of female ticks to produce larger quantities of eggs. How would you do that? Play soft music, pour them wine, unquote. Willie laughed and said, quote, didn't find anything, unquote. Quote, okay, how do you increase the fertility of ticks, unquote? He mumbled something I couldn't decipher and then said, quote, the Russians, unquote. Quote, the Russians? Did the Russians ask you to do this? Quote, unquote, I asked. Quote, they, unquote. Willie paused, then carried on. Apparently, it says so. We never know, unquote. I had no idea how to interpret that answer, so I continued. Quote, what else, unquote? Quote, Colorado tick fever virus, a mild disease. They found it produced a mild infection, unquote. If this virus were being developed as a bioweapon, it could have been harmless. Its initial symptoms included fever, chills, headaches, pain behind the eyes, light sensitivity, muscle pain, generalized malaise, abdominal pain, hypotestanomegaly, swollen liver and spleen, nausea and vomiting, and a flat, pimply rash. Contemplations could include meningitis, encephalitis, and hemorrhagic fever. But these were rare. Still, it didn't sound, quote, mild, unquote, to me. I then asked him what the goal of these tests was. Quote, the viruses lowers the antigen, unquote. Antigens are molecules on the outer surface of an invading microbe that the body recognizes as foreign, providing a signal that the invasion is underway. Theoretically, if a virulent bacteria genetic code were mixed with a virus that caused a mild infection, or if both microbes were loaded into a single tick, physicians would have recognized the physical symptoms of the novel infection, and it might not show up on a standard antibody-based screening test. I checked with Willie to see if my theory was correct. Quote, the virus lowers the antigen, so you can test for it, unquote. Quote, that is it, he said. Quote, so you are saying if you infected an enemy population, they wouldn't be able to figure out what was wrong, unquote. quote, "Yeah," unquote. 2 hours into the interview, Willie started to freeze in middle of sentences and slurred his words, signs that his diabetes was out of control. I had to get him home for his insulin shot before he passed out. As we walked arm in arm across the hotel lobby, he described how he felt to have Parkinson's disease. Quote, "I see a pebble on the sidewalk, and I stop, and my brain can't figure out how to walk around it," unquote. Ever the gentleman, he held the inn's front door open in front of me. Even though he was wobbled outside, I was afraid he'd slip on the ice in the parking lot. After I dropped him at his home, I went back to the inn to review my notes and think about the interview. First, I drew some conclusions about his mental state. Though he was having trouble speaking and word finding, I didn't think he was delusional or making things up. My gut said that he truly felt a lot of resolved guilt. He truly felt a lot of unresolved guilt about the bioweapons experiments he conducted, especially his work putting Colorado tick fever virus in ticks. Later, I reviewed the video many times and did my best to accurately interpret and transcribe what he was saying. It was frustrating that he still wouldn't disclose any key details, the who, the what, the where of the alleged bioweapons accident. He offered more than pieces of the puzzle, but for an unknown reason he was holding back the whole story. He was worried about the legal ramifications of leaking the military information. During the summer of 2013, the plight of the two high-profile whistleblowers, former CIA analyst Edward Snowden and ex-Army intelligence analyst Bradley Chelsea Manning, had been all over the news. Snowden was facing a maximum of 30 years in jail for fines leaking the classified intelligence and defense information. Manning had just received a 35-year prison sentence for providing more than 700,000 classified documents to WikiLeaks. Willie probably couldn't help noticing the message that came with all these sentences. Leak classified information and you go to jail. All I could do now was run with the clues that I had been given: the Swiss agent, the Colorado tick fever virus, the mass production of ticks, and the Russians. I left the interview with a verbal confirmation that Willie had worked with tick-borne bioweapons, and I still wasn't sure about the significance of the mystery rickettsia found in ticks during the Lyme outbreak. It could be that Willie truly believed that it was harmless to humans, and that he and his colleagues had ignored its presence and kept looking for another cause. But Willie's body language made me think that he was hiding something. I still needed something more to help me make sense of the story. So that was her interview with Willie Bergdorfer. And you can see there that, again, he didn't like come out and admit it, that's what was going on, right, with the ticks and the research that he was doing. But there was some interesting information that we can glean from the two interviews there. Now, okay, here's the picture of that 8-ball. That's interesting. I did have this marked off. The 8-ball, there's a whole chapter on the 8-ball here. We've already talked about that today a little bit. So from 145 to 146, reading from Bitten, skipping ahead here. William Patrick III, head of the producer development at Fort Detrick Bioweapons Program, Patrick had told McCleary that America's first deployable incapacitating biological weapon was an aerosolized mix of toxins, a virus, and a bacterium, designed to create a prolonged period of incapacitation across the population. The first component of staphylococcal enterotoxin B, or SEB, was a toxic waste product of a bacterium that caused food poisoning in 2 to 12 hours. Those who had breathed it in would come down with the chills, headaches, muscle pain, coughing, and fever as high as 106 degrees. The second component, Venezuelan equine influenzatic virus, encephalitis virus, would, in 5 days, cause a high fever and weakness and fatigue lasting for weeks. The third component, Q fever, would cause debilitating flu-like symptoms for weeks to months, including fever, chills, fatigue, and muscle pain. Q fever could be chronic, and sometimes even fatal. When exposed to this germ cocktail mass-produced at the Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas, theoretically few people would die, but it would put a significant percentage of the population out of commission, making an invasion easier. And no city infrastructure would be harmed. Later, Henry Kissinger questioned how non-lethal these weapons could be, and Riley noted that while they be non-lethal, only for someone with 2 nurses. Patrick went on, that would be an interesting note to go look up and see where Henry Kissinger said that. Patrick went on to say that the lethal, non-contagious bioweapons had been needed. The United States' first choice would have been a mixture of tolomeria with SEB toxin deployed in a small dry particle. This mixture delivered a massively or, quote, overwhelming, unquote, doses would shrink the incubation time for both agents and create an inflammatory storm within the body, one that would kill those at the center of the delivery within 18 hours. He stressed that such a combination weapon would not manifest as an immediately recognizable natural disease. McCleary heard many of these stories while he was hanging out with Patrick at his home in Maryland, and he was present when Patrick, shortly before the death from cancer in 2010, built a large fire in his backyard and started burning a cache of bioweapons documents. Quote, "Any records of the open-air biological tests still around?" Unquote, I asked. Quote, "Yes, they exist, especially for the 3 open-air tests for tolomeria in the South Pacific and Alaska, but they are classified. I never read them," unquote. Then I told him about the Swiss bank account receipts found in Willie's garage. He paused to consider the implications. Quote, "How much was in the account?" Unquote. Quote, "I don't know. I have several withdrawal slips, each tens of thousands of dollars. That was a lot of money in the 70s, unquote." Quote, "Wow, that's very interesting," he said, unquote. I believe, as to several other former U.S. officials who I respect, that the biological weapons program was penetrated by the Soviets, just as was the Manhattan Project. Willie had also told a friend that the Russians stole a virulent strain from his lab, and Willie told me during the interview that the Russians are in trouble. But why exactly would they be in trouble? McCleary asked. Quote, "I don't know, but these are 2 hotspots of Borrelia burgdorferi in the U.S., Connecticut, and the Great Lakes region." "So do you think that the real story is that the Russians unleashed this back on us?" he asked. "That can't be ruled out," unquote. McCleary shook his head from the side to side. Quote, "If your theory were true, they'd come after you. You'd have no idea. Even suggesting that the Russians and Soviets unleashed a biologic weapon upon the U.S. would have immense international repercussions," unquote. I suddenly felt like a chess student being scolded by a grad master for making a stupid mistake, for not being able to see 6 moves ahead. Quote, "Look at my eyes," unquote, he said. I stopped taking notes and looked up. At that moment, the face of Kennedy, the assassinated president, came into focus on the screensaver behind him. He said, quote, "You're not going to believe me when I say this, but if it is true and you can prove your thesis, this is get killed stuff. This is dangerous shit," unquote. All right. So add back my bookmark. And we'll read ahead now on page 1, actually going back to page 130 and 131. Okay. Later, he told them, so this is from the chapter Smoking Gun. This is an important section that I'm going to read into the record. Later, he told them that the government officials had visited him twice to question his research about missing agents. Lundolfer had heard about the investigations through the mutual friend, and soon after he called me to see if I wanted to review Willie's documentation before they were sent to the university for archiving, a process that can take months to years. So I booked a flight to Utah, bringing along my husband Paul to help photograph the documents. For 2 days, we dug into the boxes of Willie's lab notebooks, slides, research reports, and the tattered brown file folder labeled Dietrich 1954-56. This folder was stuffed with faded carbon copies of letters documenting Willie's bioweapons work, infecting fleas, mosquitoes, and ticks with lethal agents. There were reports of a plague-laden flea experiments, and they confirmed that Willie had told me in our last 2013 interview. Letters and reports detailed his efforts to infect mosquitoes to deliver lethal doses of Trinidad agent and deadly strains of yellow fever virus extracted from the liver of diseased persons. Lindhofer had also found some deposit slips from 2 different Swiss bank accounts tucked into the stack of unrelated documents. The real, quote, smoking gun, unquote, though, was Willie's handwritten lab notes on the patient blood tests from the disease outbreak in Connecticut. These tests showed the proof of the presence of the named, quote, Swiss agent USA, unquote, the mysterious rickettsia present in the most of the patients from the original Lyme disease outbreak, a fact that was never disclosed in the journal articles. It didn't take a PhD in microbiology to see that almost all the patient blood had reacted strongly to an antigen test for a European rickettsia that Willie had called the Swiss agent. Even more surprising, all the work was done in 1978, about 2 years before Willie. The lead author published the article reporting that the spirochete was the only cause of Lyme disease. Camera got a little crooked there. So there's the smoking gun, right? All right, let's see how far we can cruise. Actually, what I'm going to do, we're going to come back to this possibly today, possibly next week. I am going to switch gears a little bit. Now, we're going to come back and we're going to continue the reading of this at some point or where needed. I know we've done quite a bit today, and I don't want to over stress the situation or the point. But here on page, if I can find the damn page. Yeah, we'll come back to this part. There is more that I want to read into that. Now, I'm going to put my pen so I don't forget. So, again, to summarize what we just read, Willie Bergdorfer was doing tests for Fort Detrick, Maryland, for the Navy, for different factions of the U.S. military, trying to find different biological weapons agents that could be put inside of ticks and spread around using ticks. One agent that Willie thinks may be causing the Lyme disease is known as the Swiss agent, which he then identified as being inside of the patients of the victims that were having an outbreak in Lyme, Connecticut, the same spirochete that we were reading about in connection with possibly Unit 731, and those connections are going to come up more later, but it's possible that that was some of the information that was garnered from the exchange done between Japan and the United States after World War II, after learning about the Unit 731 and the Japanese Holocaust essentially that had gone on there. In World War II, there's some evidence that I have that shows a link between those two factions, or basically that the research that came out of that experimentation that was done to the people of Japan, and then us importing that information and continuing the research with Nazi scientists, and then also people like Willy Bergdorfer, who the actual, he does go down in history, but a lot of his information was classified, and all we have is these pieces. And then we have the book from Chris Newby, Bitten, that we've been reading from, that goes into a lot more depth, that spurred and sparked the House of Representatives member there, Chris, somebody, I forget his name, to actually call for an investigation into the Pentagon, which then got sidelined as like, oh, we don't really have the time for all that right now. The next thing I'm going to go into here is it's a section from a piece written by a person named Ellen Cook, and it's highly referenced, and I found this in addition to the research that I've been doing and it's good contextual information. I am going to take a break with my voice, and I'm going to actually let a robot read again to us. I don't feel like that went too bad last week, honestly, but that's probably because I listened to a lot of material that's not even like official audiobook. Like, I take these books and things that I'm reading to you today, these documents, and I'll listen to them as well as read them. So I'm used to robot voices reading. I can jive with that. So I'll see how it goes and listen back to this, but it gives me a chance to take a break while still like keeping the information flowing into the stream. So the podcasts can be more succinct, more complete, include more information, and not have like a limitation like, oh man, I need to take a break real quick. Well, I can take a quick break, and we'll go ahead and let this read into the record. It's called Spirochete Warfare by Ellen Cook, and let's see how this goes. We will do it live.
Spirochete Warfare by Ellen Cook. Introduction. Borrelia, the microbes which cause Lyme disease, are a subtype of the wider biological classification of spirochetes. Now it has become apparent that the spirochetes were weaponized over 75 years ago. That knowledge comes to us from a book published in 1944. The title of the book is Japan's Secret Weapon, by Barclay Newman, a leading science writer of the time, as well as former U.S. Navy malaria scientist. For decades, the public health agencies of the U.S. and other NATO countries have denied the existence of virulent cell wall deficient forms of spirochetes. The lack of a cell wall renders microbes resistant to penicillin and related antibiotics, as these work precisely by disrupting the formation of new cell walls during bacterial replication. The minute size and pleomorphic nature of these forms, in contrast to the striking spiral shape of a typical spirochete as featured in modern microbiology textbooks, made these microbes appear invisible, above all to those who did not wish, or did not wish others, to see them. This WW2-era book helps to confirm what some investigating the history of Lyme disease have long suspected, that the official denial of the devastating pathogenic nature of the granule and other L forms, 1, of Lyme causing Borrelia, is related to their biological warfare significance. To put it bluntly, Newman's book provides cogent circumstantial evidence that many cell wall deficient forms of Borrelia are in fact weaponized spirochetes, nurtured, cultured and optimized for aerosol delivery. The following essay is based on the information in Chapter 4 of Newman's book. The title of the chapter is simply Spirochete Warfare. Background. For many decades it was assumed that the horrors of the Second World War did not include the use of biological weapons. Finally, in the 1980s, thanks to the diligent efforts of historians and investigative journalists, the barbaric crimes of the Japanese Unit 731 were revealed to the general public. Unit 731 and related units practiced mass medical experimentation, including the cutting open of living human beings, who endured grotesque surgical operations without anesthetic. Often the purpose was to observe directly the hemorrhaging and other changes in the organs of the victim, man, woman, or child, as he or she died in agony from a deliberately induced infectious disease. As well as human experimentation, the Japanese scientists launched attacks with plague and other weapons of mass destruction, killing many thousands of Chinese and other victims. The true death toll of these atrocities is not yet known outside of classified circles. Though the U.S. government has long denied it, not only were they fully aware of the Japanese and Nazi biowarfare programs, but also, incredibly, after the war, they protected the architects of these programs of death from prosecution as war criminals. This was in order to recruit them for the American biological weapons program against the Soviet bloc, which they duly did. We now know, for example, that the U.S. allowed leading Nazi bioweaponeer Erich Traub to play a major role in setting up research at their biowarfare lab on Plum Island, a stone's throw away from Lyme, Connecticut, where the first recorded outbreak of Lyme disease in America occurred in the 1970s. Traub's germ warfare knowledge was considered so important that, his Nazi past notwithstanding, he was invited to take charge of scientific research on the island in the 1950s. Like Traub, Japanese biowarfaremen were similarly greeted with open arms, their wartime atrocities hushed up. In return for their cooperation, the US allowed these monsters to occupy some of the most prestigious and influential posts in Japanese medicine, till their retirement decades later. Newman's fear. During the war, Barclay Newman, leading science writer and former malariologist with the US Navy, became aware that the Japanese were building up a program of deadly biological weaponry. Desperate to warn his countrymen of what he believed was an impending Armageddon, he wrote a book entitled Japan's Secret Weapon. At the time, the American military authorities wanted to ban his book, but later decided that to do so would call too much attention to the very issues they considered it necessary to cover up. Instead, they resorted to arranging a smear campaign against the author, and unfavorable reviews dismissing Newman's revelations as alarmist fantasy were published in the press. Today, thanks to the efforts of leading historians, we know that Newman's fears regarding a Japanese biological program of mass destruction were soundly based, and indeed, one of the most authoritative works on the history of biowarfare, Unit 731, relies on information found in Newman's book, 2. Japan's Secret Weapon contains no less than 28 pages on one aspect of the Japanese bioweapon program, spirochete warfare. Newman begins his chapter of the same name by lamenting the widespread disbelief, in his era, of the true devastating potential of germ warfare. He then alleges that 2 to 3 years before Pearl Harbor, Nazi and Japanese scientists cooperated in warfare against or with spirochetes, in Hawaii. Original author's italics. What he is referring to is an exceptionally virulent outbreak of the spirochetal disease leptospirosis, also known as Weil's disease, and known at the time in Germany as slime fever. With official reports of 44% mortality from the outbreak, Newman states, "Consult the authorities, and you will find out that, very definitely, so high a mortality is attained only by Japanese strains of spirochetes of slime fever." In his characteristic tongue-in-cheek style, Newman goes on to say the following. Suppose you consult a spirochete specialist in his laboratory at an institute devoted to research on tropical diseases. This specialist is busy, of course. But not so busy as he ought to be or as he will be later. It is difficult, even for an expert technician, to catch and recognize a spirochete, the specialist informs you. So here are some pictures from the gallery of the world's worst rogues. Newman goes on to describe a picture of a typical syphilis spirochete, in a manual offered by the hypothetical spirochetologist to the reader, and then says, "Bacterium, you ask? No, according to the Japanese, who know the most about spirochetes, they are like bacteria in being low forms of plant life, that is, fungi. The Japanese claim that spirochetes are closely related to bacteria but are not bacteria, among which spiral forms are found. Like bacteria, spirochetes reproduce by splitting across the middle. But the Japanese think that a spirochete can also break itself into many tiny granules, each as small as the invisible molecule of a virus, and each capable of recreating a new spirochete. Bacteria do not seem to multiply in this odd way. The Japanese say that there is no drug effective against this spirochete. Emphasis mine. It is important to bear in mind that these words were written at the dawn of the antibiotic era. Today many patients who have been lucky enough to receive a correct diagnosis of their Lyme disease have been cured, or had their symptoms alleviated, by modern therapeutic agents. The imaginary spirochetologist goes on to explain that much of the research on spirochetes current at that time, and even the manuals in use by U.S. forces and the Public Health Service, are based on Japanese findings. In Newman's scenario, the reader goes on to examine pictures of syphilis, Borrelia, and other spirochetes, in the U.S. military manual, all originating from Japanese drawings. You find out that Inada and Ito were the great investigators of the spirochetes of slime fever. When you peer closely at the dainty Japanese pictures of this spirochete, you perceive that, although at first sight it seems to be a chain of bright dots, it is really a slender thread whose spiraling gives the impression of beating. The thread is curved or hooked at one or both ends. The living spiral propels itself by rotary motion of the hook, as the Japanese discovered. Newman then describes how the work of Hideo Noguchi, acclaimed worldwide for his discovery of the syphilis spirochete as the cause of general paresis in 1913, was continued in Japanese labs. Japanese technicians took a hint from Noguchi and forced the spirochete to multiply on special jellies. The Japanese have reported that you can increase the virulence, or killing power, of these spirals by growing them in flesh and blood, of guinea pig or man. Emphasis mine. It is useful to remember at this point that the difficulty in culturing spirochetes using normal, ethical methods, was not just a pitfall of WW2 era technology. The resistance of many spirochetes, including Borrelia, to culture in vitro remains a problem for lab scientists even today. In Japan, vaccines for prophylaxis have long been in use. But non-Japanese workers cannot make such vaccines. None but the Japanese seems to know how to use spirochete vaccines to prevent the spread of an epidemic. Newman goes on to discuss the Japanese discoveries of spirochetal agents of Nanakayami, 7-day fever, and Akiyami, autumn fever, and then, referring to one of the original discoverers of the causative agent of leptospirosis, states, Inada has reported that the Japanese know how to get virus-like, quite invisible particles or spirochete fragments from special cultures of spirochetes of infectious jaundice. The Japanese say that such infinitesimals can be used to infect animals and men, by spraying droplets containing these spirochete-creating bits into the air, or spreading them through water, or scattering them in mud or damp soil. Emphasis mine. Newman then discusses the prevalence of leptospirosis worldwide, and his imaginary spirochete expert notes. Immediately before the Japanese invasion of China, Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and the Malay states, and shortly before the Japanese invasion of India and the Japanese strokes at Australia, the very first outbreaks of slime fever were reported from every one of these areas. After an enigmatic discussion about American and British outbreaks of leptospirosis, and the tick-borne disease tularemia in the US, the latter Newman's scientist describes as having somehow gotten accidentally from Japan, the reader, in the hypothetical discussion, asks about antibiotics. Why can't sulfa drugs be used? Simply because they have no effect on the spirochetes. What about penicillin? The newspapers say that penicillin is effective where other miracle drugs fail. That's an enthusiastic way of telling you that penicillin is effective against certain infections caused by bacteria which are not influenced by sulfa drugs. As the Japanese have pointed out, spirochetes are not bacteria. And just to give you some idea of the distance to a cure-all, the Japanese actually grow dysentery bacilli and other bacteria in cultures saturated with sulfa drugs. In this way they get strains which are not only more virulent but completely resistant to sulfa drugs. Other bacteria not affected by the most miraculous new synthetics are those of tuberculosis and leprosy. For the worst plagues there are as yet no drugs at all. They, i.e. the Japanese, find spirochetes especially fascinating. And they never give up. In 1940, Masao Mujimurai reported new successes in transmitting syphilis spirochetes from cultures grown for many years in the laboratories of Tokyo Imperial University, doubtless the very cultures started in a small way by Noguchi. Fujimori, sick, was testing out the effects of spreading two different parasites into the same guinea pig at the same time. The Japanese discovered that one parasite promotes the lethal action of the other. He demonstrated that diphtheria bacilli are more virulent when used along with syphilis. Sometimes the Japanese think up the damnedest experiments, such as the transmission of syphilis by spraying the spirochetes into the air or into the eyes of animals or volunteers. Infection is thus accomplished. Japanese technicians have been not only the outstandingly successful cultivators of spirochetes and many other very deadly germs but also the sole successful mass producers of the most dangerous and horrible microbes. Some of the apparently fantastic claims of new methods of transmission by Japanese specialists have been investigated and their truth established in American laboratories years after the claims were first made. Therefore, if you want to speculate further about the possibilities of spirochete warfare, you can be sure that the Japanese know how to spread any spirochete disease, slime fever, syphilis, yaws, sodoku, 3, relapsing fever, by spraying droplets laden with specially cultured spirochetes. So they do not have to drop infected fleas, rats or even leopards from planes, as suggested by popular writers. Relapsing fever is caused by the Borrelia genus of bacteria, and is generally transmitted to man either by lice, or by the bite of a tick. It is worth noting, too, that recent investigations into the genetic makeup of Lyme Borrelia have found some strains apparently more closely related to relapsing fever Borrelia than to Borrelia burgdorferi, long considered the only Borrelia capable of causing Lyme disease. The spirochetalogist continues. It would cost only a few thousand yen, possibly only a few yen if you pieced out the work in homes, to produce enough spirochetes to infect a nation or even a continent. As to methods of broadcasting spirochetes secretly so as to avoid detection and reprisal, you yourself can probably list hundreds of different furtive techniques if you put your mind on the problem. Such broadcast spirochetes and super spirochetes bred to order would stay alive in dust, water, damp soil, mud, food. And none would be the wiser. Cases and epidemics would not break out until the enemy had been gone for days, weeks, or even months. The conversation continues. Are spirochetes really doing any significant killing anywhere? Slime fever kills its thousands, syphilis and yaws their tens of thousands, and spirochete relapsing fever its hundreds of thousands if not its millions. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, where? In Africa today, where it is spread among tens of millions by ticks, lice, and bedbugs. The spirochete of relapsing fever is almost as important a killer as malaria and trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness. The spirochete virulence varies widely, only a small percent may succumb, but in a few epidemics the mortality has attained 75%. In West Africa in a recent epidemic extending through several years, probably 10% of the entire population was killed off by spirochetes running wild from Morocco and Algiers down the Niger to Senegal and the French Sudan, southward to the Gold Coast and Nigeria. Perhaps 1 million natives died in this one epidemic. Newman's spirochetologist then suggests that the tropical spirochetal disease yaws would be an even more likely candidate for dissemination by the Japanese, due to the fact that apart from flies, the disease may be spread by contact with infected objects and any direct contact with a sufferer. He describes how, after an incubation period of a few weeks, yaws causes joint pains, digestive disturbances, headache, fever, and a skin nodule surrounded by a ring of inflammation. A few months later further sores break out and the headache and joint pains intensify. The symptoms are recurrent and in the late stages the victim suffers horrific deformity of his face as the spirochetes rot the bones of the nose, palate, and eye. The spirochetologist reassures the reader that a deliberate dissemination of yaws in temperate climates could be controlled by modern hygiene measures and drugs. Asked why yaws and other epidemics were not controlled in the Philippines, given that disease and not the Japanese beat us in the Philippines, the scientist simply shrugs. Such an oversight is out of my province. How many lives would you say such an oversight has cost? Hundreds of thousands of lives and millions of casualties in the Philippines alone, within a space of a very few years, say 5. Newman's scientist discusses, with more than a dollop of cynicism, the fact that recent efforts by U.S. scientists to duplicate experiments in the culture of yaws and syphilis spirochetes published by Noguchi and his successors have failed. Now we find that no spirochetes develop in such jellies, even though the Japanese directions are followed painstakingly. Essential information must have been withheld by the Japanese. Nevertheless, it is difficult to believe that Noguchi would in his magnificent benevolence countenance such secrecy. Noguchi had a world view. The chapter concludes with a discussion of Sodoku, and the fact that Japanese researchers had found these microbes in the noses of lepers in India, even though it is normally acquired not by the airborne route, but by the bite of an animal. The Japanese reported that these bacteria were then able to infect volunteers. Newman, referring to biowarfare as oligodynamic warfare, concludes his chapter on spirochetes with the following chilling words. In oligodynamic warfare, pygmies amok may lose the thunderbolts of the gods. Lyme disease, like that other spirochetal disease, syphilis, is known as a great imitator. It is believed to be able to mimic dozens of conditions, including amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, attention deficit disorder, multiple sclerosis, autism, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and many more. Recent evidence has even linked it with the devastating plague of Alzheimer's. 4. 5. Could we, in the 21st century, be witnessing the shocking legacy of attempts to unleash the thunderbolts of the gods? Japan's Secret Weapon by Barclay Newman was published by Current Publishing Co., New York in 1944. At the time of writing, November 2008, it is still available to the public at various online booksellers, at prices ranging from $25 to $100. 6. Elena Cook can be contacted at the following email address: elena444cook@yahoo.co.uk. References: 1. L forms are variants of bacteria lacking a cell wall. The L refers to the Lister Institute where they were studied in the 1930s.
Okay, I'll save you from having to hear the actual references being read by the robot, but that will be linked up in the show notes with 2 different posts, with that one there that I found in archive. Now, that person that wrote that article was referring to a book that I have pulled up here. The book was called Japan's Secret Bio-Weapon from 1944. I don't have a copy of that, but it looks like it's achievable. I'm not sure how hard it would be to get a first edition, but it looks like ABE Books also has a copy of that I could try to get. And then the person from the article there was, again, Elena Cook. And if you do a search for spirochete warfare, Elena Cook, the first thing you're going to get up is like a Facebook post. And so when I had first read that, I was like seeing it on Facebook, and I was like, I don't know, like what this is. Okay, so I just searched it, and I guess it's not the first result. It was before, though. There was like a Facebook post, but this is basically just pasted in here, that same article, and then they reference it back to here, which was not there. So I went and archive.org'd that and found copies of that article, and I'll link that in the show notes, and you can read through. She was summarizing a chapter from Japan's Secret Weapon from 1944, where they were also researching spirochetes and spirochete warfare, and had done testing with that in Unit 731. So that's what we were talking about just before that. Now, interestingly enough, while literally I pressed, play on that, I turned around, my son walks in the room, and he hands me a couple packages. All right, one of the packages has some audio routing cables that I needed. Okay, this is a instrument cable, balanced TRC cable or something like that. And this will go from my amp to my mixer, and more on that to come someday, maybe. And then I always buy 2 cables. Like when I buy cables, I'm like, if that doesn't work, I'll buy another one just in case that one works. And then I'll have a spare. Now, that's not the exciting thing. The exciting thing that showed up is Gene Wars, Military Control Over the New Genetic Technologies, from Charles Piller and Keith R. Yamamoto. Now, if you remember, last week I was making a mistake, and I actually kept referring to a 1988 book. Well, this is the 1988 book that I was actually trying to recall. So, Gene Wars, Military Control Over New Genetic Technologies, is a book that I've heard referenced a lot in doing this research, so I figured I better get that book. And I have not read it all the way through. I've not listened to it all the way through. But the fact that it showed up as soon as I turned around, I was able to go in and actually mark up a few sections. So we will go more into this book in the future, but let's just read a little bit about what it's about. So, this penetrating investigation reveals the extent of the efforts by the Executive Branch and Department of Defense to develop military capacity in infectious organisms. Piller and Yamamoto have unearthed and organized information normally unavailable to the layperson. physicians and medical scientists. It should be read not only by physicians, medical researchers, biologists, and environmentalists, but by anyone concerned with their long-range health and welfare of our children and our planet. That was from Jonathan King, PhD, Department of Biology, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Charles Piller is an investigative journalist. It's probably like PR or something. I'm just going to say Piller, whose articles on biological warfare, science, labor, and international affairs have appeared in magazines and newspapers across the country, including The Nation, the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Baltimore Sun. He lives in Oakland, California. Keith Yamamoto, a molecular biologist who earned a PhD degree from Princeton University, is a professor and a vice chairman of the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics at the University of California in San Francisco. He lives in San Francisco, California. So this book, Gene Wars, Military Control Over the New Genetic Technologies, was written in 1988. And we'll just read a little bit into the introduction here, since this literally just showed up in the mail like 10 minutes ago. In June 1989, the years of painstaking lab experiments finally pay off. Soviet molecular biologists at top secret research institutes. Can't find my pointer, huh? Oh, it's in the other book. At top research institutes in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk, successfully employed genetic engineering techniques to create novel disease organisms. A super pathogenic strain of dengue fever, a viral disease epidemic to tropical areas around the world. The new organism is codenamed D7, a classified Soviet document from page 14, leaked by a dissident scientist, compares it with a normal dengue. D7 is a marvel, a sinister ingenuity, the perfect biological weapon. At first glance, it is indistinguishable from its natural parent, and even extended analysis writes off D7 as a product of natural mutation. Rapacious and fast-acting, it reliably incapacitates everyone in its path, rendering people helpless, but killing only a handful. Seems like something they often try to achieve with these biological weapons, huh? Norvenbergs has come up with a D7 vaccine 100% effective in human trials. The Soviets waste little time. By late July, a refrigerated supply of the virus and several handheld biological fogging devices are secretly shipped via Cuba to Salvadoran FMLN rebels deep in the hills of north-central El Salvador. At 2 a.m. on July 31st, a small vaccinated commando squad creeps forward to the El Parisios Army Base, a supply center at the northern region. They silently bathe the base in D7. Before dawn, the covert raid is completed, and the guerrillas steal back to mountain camps. And they all get very sick, I assume. But yeah, this book has a lot of interesting sections in it that I've already kind of thumbed through and noted as something that should be looked at. But, I realize that I'm getting a little bit all over the place if I jump into Gene Wars. So let's save Gene Wars for next week. We'll mix in Gene Wars readings, maybe next week or the week after. And, we'll continue on with our Lab 257 and the spirochetes research that we were just reading about, as well as the Operation Paperclip, Eric Traub, and the Nazis, and the Nazi scientists that were brought in via Operation Paperclip to continue the study of biological weapons research and vaccinations and all these other things, which are really just biological weapons. Now, let's finish up with our book reading of Chris Newby, though, so that we can call it a good job done and we don't have to come back to it. Or not that we won't come back to it, but that I can feel like I did it justice today, because this was sort of the money shot today, right? This was what we've been leading up to for the past few weeks of, this is not just Tyler's crazy theory. For those that are just now coming along, with what we're talking about is the current Bio-PsyWar ongoing plague pandemic C-19 and its most likely origins by the U.S. military. And, the thing that I'm floating out there that might be more edgy is that it was an intentional release, and that's part of the Bio-PsyWar that we're currently living in. So, from page 218 and 219 of Chris Newby's book, Bitten, toward the end of my investigation, I re-examined the history of Lyme disease through the eyes of an arson investigator. Standing knee-deep in the ashes of a bioweapons program, the first thing I noticed was that the outbreak began early than most people realized in the late 1960s, when the military was conducting many open-air tests of aerosolized bacteria and aggressive Lone Star ticks. Polly Murray, the Connecticut mother who first started documenting cases of Lyme disease, wrote that she first developed swollen knees and severe headaches in the spring of 1967, shortly after the virus disseminated the nearby Long Island duck industry, or decimated. When Murray visited her doctor and asked if her illness could have been caused by the ticks, he said, quote, "Rocky Mountain spotted fever is not present with the kind of symptoms you're having," unquote. Alan Steer from Yale University didn't begin investigating cases around Old Lyme until 1975. And in the first article on Lyme arthritis, he noted that one man's symptoms started as early as 1968. 4 more cases were identified in southeastern Connecticut, beginning in 1972. Willie's involvement in the outbreak began in the summer of 1975 with a 3-week trip to Nantucket, Cape Cod, and Martha's Vineyard. That year, 9 people on Nantucket came down with babesiosis, and a few people on Martha's Vineyard fell ill with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. 1 person died. Willie's investigation was interrupted by his Swiss tick collecting trip in 1978, and upon his return he began analyzing Jorge Benach's Long Island ticks. Or it could be George Benach Long Island ticks. That's when he recognized that there was something different about the rickettsia he was seeing. Under a microscope, they looked like spotted fever rickettsias, but they didn't show up on the standard tests, and they didn't always cause the expedited pinprick rashes. These rickettsias caused a spot-free spotted fever. Why did Willie go on an NIH-funded Swiss sabbatical in the middle of a U.S. rickettsia outbreak? And why did the newly discovered Long Island rickettsia test positive to the European Swiss agent tests? Answers unknown. Based on the letters to Steer, Banach, and others in 1979. Hold on a second. Don't want to forget those. Willie seemed convinced that the new rickettsia could be the causative agent of Lyme disease. This possibly was reflected in a project report from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease (NIAID) for the period ending in 1930-1979. Only R. rickettsia has thus far been etologically associated with human illness, and indications are that the other 3 are virulent for man, as well as for experimental animals. Although tantalizing evidence based on serologic responses in residents from Long Island and California suggest an inapparent or missed infection may sometimes occur. There was nothing in the official NIH progress reports of 1979 and 1980 about the Long Island and Connecticut blood samples testing positive for European Swiss agent antigens. And in 1979 report Willie wrote, quote, "The Swiss agent is pathogenic to meadow voles, chick embryos, and several lines of tissue culture cells, but not for guinea pigs," a finding that contradicted later claims that it was harmless. Okay, so that's interesting. The Swiss agent and Mr. Bergdorfer and his opinions about it there. We're going to keep going here and skip ahead to pages, just seeing if this was something I wanted to read. The meeting attendees were an international mix of biologists. Okay, now I'm going to jump ahead here. And I know today I've been just diving into spots in the book, and it's, hard to keep up potentially. So what I would suggest to do is potentially just go grab the book and try reading it for yourself if you'd like the full context, and watch some of the interviews with Chris Newby. But I hope we kind of round off here and are able to kind of drive the point home that we've been trying to build up to. Okay, so reading from page 229. I pondered why Lyme disease researchers were so much more paranoid than their rickettsia counterparts. Thinking back on my research for the Lyme documentary Under Our Skin, I concluded that there was much more money at stake with Lyme disease. It was the first major new disease discovered after the Bayh-Dole Act and the Diamond versus Chakrabarty Supreme Court decisions made. Possibly for the NIH and the CDC, the universities to patent and profit from ownership of live organisms. So let me start here in the next sentence. When the causative or organisms behind Lyme disease was announced, something akin to the Oklahoma land rush of 1989 began, as scientists within the industry began furiously filing patents on the surface proteins and the DNA of the Lyme spirochete, hoping to profit from the future vaccines and diagnostic tests that used these markers. For example, the NIH employee who patents the bacterial surface protein used in a commercial test kit or a vaccine could receive up to $150,000 in royalty payments a year, an amount that might double his or her annual salary. All of a sudden, the institutions that were supposed to be protectors of public health became business partners with Big Pharma. The university's researchers who had previously shared information on dangerous emerging diseases were now delaying publishing and their findings so they could become entrepreneurs and profit from the patents from their university technology transfer groups. We essentially lost our system of scientific checks and balances, and this is in turn an undermined patent trust in institutions, and this in turn has undermined patient trust in the institutions that are supposed to, quote, do no harm, unquote. With Lyme disease, there's no profit incentive for proactively treating someone within a few weeks of inexpensive, off-patent antibiotics. It's the patentable vaccines and mandatory tests before treatment that bring the steady revenue each year after year. So she's uncovering there, why there could be cover-ups, and there's probably a lot more to it than money and just being able to profit off of it. But she makes a good point there that's not hard for people to wrap their head around as far as that goes. Now, one thing I don't want to miss before I jump into that, we may read the epilogue, but is a quote here from Willie, and it says, "It's now clear that the Borrelia burgdorferi can persist within the nervous system for years, causing progressive illness. An increasing increasing evidence suggests also that the spirochete can remain latent there for years before producing clinical symptoms. Willy Bergdorfer, the brain involvement in Lyme disease. And now we'll read the epilogue. And the quote at the top says, "Your beliefs will be light by which you see, but they will not be what you see, and they will not be a substitute for seeing." Flannery O'Connor, Mystery of the Manners, Occasional Prose. I believe history will judge the tick-borne disease outbreak that began in 1968 as one of the worst public health failures of the last century. In the beginning, we were slow to recognize this triple threat, a situation that is now out of control, spreading far and wide, could have been contained with an early intervention of tick control projects and public education campaign. The myopic focus on only one of the tick diseases, Lyme disease, has led to treatment delays and fatalities in patients with serious mixed infections. Physicians urgently need rapid screening tests and the freedom to use clinical judgment in treating these complex patient cases without the real and present danger of losing their medical licenses. What this book brings to light is that the U.S. military has conducted thousands of experiments exploring the use of ticks and tick-borne diseases as biological weapons, and in some cases these agents escaped into the environment. The government needs to declassify the details of these open-air bioweapons tests so that they can bring repair to damages to the pathogens are inflicting on humans and animals in the ecosystem. She's right there, you have to accept what's been done in order to fix it. Otherwise, if you just keep shoving it under the rug, you'll never fix it, right? Where did this devil's brew of tick-borne disease come from? If you believe Willy Bergdorfer, and I do, there was a deliberate release or an accident, an experiment with unintended consequences to the environment. Yet after 5 years of research, I wasn't able to find verifiable documents confirming the Long Island incident. I'm not sure why Willie refused to fully disclose the details before his death. With his passing, the only way to know the truth is for a whistleblower to step forward or for a classified report to be released. It has been 50 years since the mysterious outbreak of tick-borne diseases began, and fixing it is going to require extraordinary efforts. We have an ecosystem out of balance, with the climate change enabling aggressive disease-carrying ticks to move into new territories. Our medical system is still reluctant to test for and treat Lyme disease and tick co-infections. No significantly new diagnosis or treatment protocols have been introduced since Lyme disease was discovered, and our broken government is underfunding tick disease research. If the outbreak was caused by a U.S. accident, we need it exposed. If it was a hostile act by a foreign actor, then it shows how woefully unprepared we are for future attacks. My hope is that this book will widen the lens of our view of the problem and inspire people to more aggressively pursue solutions. We need CDC to streamline and bring more accuracy to our tick-borne disease surveillance system. We need more DNA detectives and to decode the genomes of these pathogens so we can devise ways to disrupt the damages they do. We need epidemiologists to analyze the ongoing spread of these diseases, incorporating the possibility that they were spread in an unnatural way. We need, quote, big data, unquote, medical bioinformationists to analyze our electronic medical records to define diagnostic symptoms, profiles that map disease combinations and geographical locations. And finally, we need the next generation of bright, curious scientists to lead the charge. All right, so there we go. That's got us through the reading of today's book, Bitten. Now, I might take some issue with some of those things that were said as in the end there, as far as like what we need to do. I do believe with the writing of the book and spreading the information that those are things that we could be doing to help spread awareness about these issues, to help resolve them, and also to not put our trust so much in the institutions that tell us, you know, how the current pandemic is unfolding and what the next steps are, without asking more questions about, you know, where did this come from and how much information are they aware of about it, and how much information, you know, is there that these vaccines that are being proposed were not, you know, planned ahead of time. How do you plan ahead of time for vaccines that you didn't, you know that the pandemic was coming, or did they? I don't know. Seems really strange with the Bill and Melinda Gates, like Event 201, Clade X, Johnson and Johnson, or sorry, the slipping up a little bit there, but the the interests that were involved in investigating pandemic preparedness and talking about how it would unfold. The whole Event 201 thing was like a whole played out scenario, where they're actually showing what could happen in this coronavirus outbreak from a coronavirus outbreak from pigs. And again, like, well, maybe they need to be doing those types of research with everything they know that's going on, because it's quite evident that there could be a bioweapons terror attack. And that's kind of the premise that I'm putting forward, is that somebody else that's much deeper into these realms, you know, they've thought this through. And if they can get out in front of the attack, then they can control the outcomes. But it still doesn't stop the fact now that all this research has been done, and gain of function research on making chimera viruses, and now is basically readily available to governments, to bad actors, to be able to just print out these bioweapons, like I've said before, not literally printing them out, but essentially making them in their garage. You know, homemade labs could be producing bioweapons which could incapacitate whole regions of people, you know, whole areas. And if you aerosolize those and are able to put them in the air or the water supply or something like that, you know, we're made to believe from the mainstream narrative that this is a virus that jumped from a animal species into humans and became extremely virulent through that procedure. And that's not, you know, it's not to say that like disease or bacteria or things from animals can't make a human sick. They obviously can. Like if you look at cats carry around diseases and things that people can get. But all of a sudden to be this highly infectious agent that spreads over the whole planet, right? This novel coronavirus, that all the markers of it say that it was an engineered bioweapon that was released intentionally to spread this way through it, and they aerosolized it itself, making a gain of function virus, and either are aerosolizing it and putting it in the air currently, or that was done, or it was, you know, put in subway. I mean, they have all these different ways that they could have released it near and around in China to set up China as the fall guy for this. Similar to how like they'll link Saudi Arabia documents back to funding of 9/11 terrorists or things like they'll give the fallout to other countries being involved, but they don't circle back to show you how it connects to directly into the U.S. funding of biological weapons research, of course, for defensive national security purposes, you know. And so today, you know, we've gone a little bit deep into the rabbit hole here of the Bio-PsyWar. We're going to continue on, though. We're not going to stop there. We're going to keep going down the rabbit hole here. There was plenty of articles that I wanted to go into that I'm going to save for the next episode. But what I am going to do to close out today is we're going to go into a researcher who I've known, not like personally, but I've been around her online and kind of watched her work grow and definitely enjoyed her work over the years. And her name is Jana, or Jana Epps, or ESP. And I had her website up here. Dang it. And I've lost it. Here it is. Her website is janaesp.com. And the best way I could describe her is as an artist and a researcher. So she's able to take the research that she does and put it into an art form, and just beautiful documentaries, absolutely well done, well researched, well sourced. And I've only become familiar with the recent series that she's doing, Tyranny and Eugenics Through Public Health, Bioterrorism, and Vaccines. Last week or so, I came across episode 9. I think I had saw episode 1 like some time ago and kind of didn't keep up with it for some reason. And then recently I watched episode 9. I have been going through it this week, obviously. All props to anything that I uncover that comes out of, viewing Jana's documentary, and then I might take a clip or something that I found and put it in here. But me, not rather than be like, acting like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to put this in my show notes. I want you guys to watch the whole series. I think she does a stand-up, blowout job at, getting the information out there in a really creative way. And today we're going to watch 30 minutes of part 9. So this is jumping way, 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 way ahead in the series. And it's not meant to like encapsulate the series and be like, there it was, guys, you saw it now, because there's a lot more. The idea is to sample. I want to give a sample, kind of like you go to Costco, and they give you a little sample when you go through. That's what we're doing now. We're just giving you a taste. We could have some live viewers out there. According to the stats here, there's still some people watching. Good job, guys. You've hung in there with the monotone reading and a little bit of cotton dry mouth here going on from all the reading today. But I really appreciate you guys for sticking around, and this is going to be worth it for those that are interested in this type of research. We'll go into this clip, and I am going to, then get up, stretch while this is playing, get the show ready to publish as an MP3. We put the show up, again, on a lot of various podcast places. Those with Android phones can just use Podcast Addict and grab our RSS feed. But this goes out as an MP3 to make it more easy for you to digest. So I understand like people aren't going to sit and watch these longer episodes, but what I'm sort of envisioning is that what they might like to do is download the audio, have it for on the go, being able to reference and hear. And, if I don't expect everybody to be interested in biological weapons research or to dwell in the sewage, right? We don't want to do that. After this, I'm going to get up, go spend some time with my family. We're going to, be decorating for the boys' birthdays next weekend. Both the boys next weekend have a birthday coming up. Dante will be turning 3, and Vinny will be turning 10. So big numbers for both the boys coming up. I want to be able to get them the things they need. It's really important to us to celebrate the kids' birthdays and get them a lot of gifts and do what we can, while we still can for the family. So yeah, my focus isn't like every day living in this world of the bioterrorism's research, right? Now, I can get a little fanatic about things, and I use that to my ability to research and learn more and then help share with others. So I don't see a problem with that. I'm not using, my ability to kind of deep dive into things to obsess over unhealthy things for me. I feel like, again, like Chris was saying there, like the more we expose this information, the more we can get it out into the general knowledge and that raise the consciousness of the events that have occurred. That's how we could potentially solve these things. So if there's recombinant DNA, mosquito viruses being sprayed all over us and we're all filled with all these things, if we keep ignoring that that's going on and that, there very well could be nanotechnology inside of us, as we'll hear in this upcoming clip, and that's what the spraying is, or that's what this really, even the illness could be caused by like cadmium being in the air, and a lot of the effects are very similar to like metal or toxicity effects, losing the taste in your mouth and the smell and these things like that. This could be an activation of frequencies in the environment, and we've been putting the soft metal tissues inside of us. That's, again, sort of a farther out theory of mine, but I think that the jabs and all that, that's more of a consensual thing. That's more to move money around in the economy and basically a grand theft world type situation. But the abilities that they need, that people think they would need to inject you, that the ability is there inherently almost in a remote control type of way at this point, but inherently with the technologies that they've developed to be able to do various things in a remote controlled way, let's say. We'll go into that more in the Bio-PsyWar it definitely plays in. For now, we'll cut to tyranny and eugenics through the public health, bioterrorism, and vaccines part 9. In case I don't come back to comment after this, it's been great streaming with you guys today and getting part 6 out here of the Bio-PsyWar. We are in a sub part 2 of the Tick-Tok operation, the Talkeration, the Tick-Tok Bio-Op part 2 from the Bio-PsyWar from TylerBloyer.com. Really appreciate you guys watching and enjoy this next clip. It'll be about a little bit longer of a clip, so just hang in there.
Biochemist Dr. Garth Nicholson exposes how mycoplasma has been weaponized and how they are connected to the new emerging diseases: neurodegenerative, autoimmune, respiratory, gastrointestinal, immunosuppressive disease disorders, chronic illnesses, and specifically CFS, autism, rheumatoid arthritis, Gulf War syndrome, and Lyme disease.
So my hypothesis for this lecture is that the emergence of new illnesses and the increase in incidence rates of those that have been described previously are due to our increasing toxic environment. So there's also a role here of environment. And this has to do with our immune system and our endocrine system, and also the purposeful development and testing of new weapons of mass destruction. Because some of the infections that we found, both in civilians and within the military, have more to do with the development of new biologic agents than they have to do with the natural emergence of infectious diseases. So what kinds of things are we talking about? Well, you've all heard of bacteria and viruses. You might not have, and probably you have heard of, in this context of this meeting, heard of small bacterial microorganisms called mycoplasmas, and I'm going to talk more about them because they're one of the emerging infections that happen to be involved in a variety of different chronic illnesses. But they're not the only thing out there. I'm just concentrating on that because we've happened to have done a lot of research in that area. So chronic infections are often misdiagnosed or not even sought, and because of this, infections are either untreated or inappropriately treated. The fact that your GP, your general practitioner, really doesn't know much about these infections. And the reason he doesn't know about these infections is they're really not discussed in medical school any longer. They were 25 years ago, but they're not even taught now. And I know this because I taught in medical schools at the University of California and the University of Texas for over 25 years, so I know the curriculum quite well. So what kind of diseases are we talking about? Well, we now know that chronic infections play a very important role in a variety of different diseases. So if we just look at mycoplasmal infections, a small, very tiny pleomorphic bacteria that doesn't really have a cell wall, and it gets inside our cells and causes havoc with our metabolism and other aspects of the cell. If we just look at a number of diseases, we find this all over the place. For example, in chronic fatigue syndrome, 50 to 60% of patients have this infection. It's probably much higher than that, but the tests are not easy for this type of microorganism. Autism spectrum disorders, different studies that we've done, different parts of the country in the U.S., 58 to 65%, fibromyalgia syndrome, up to 65%, rheumatoid arthritis, about half the patients, Lyme disease, up to 65% have this as a co-infection with the Lyme Borrelia. And we come down to other diseases like ALS, for example, up to 90% of patients have this infection. So these fall in the category, these slow-acting chronic agents, in the broad category of non-lethal biologic warfare agents. And why do we put them in that category? Well, we put them in that category because several nations, including the U.S. and other nations, have developed these as chronic biological warfare agents. So I'm not putting these on the list because we think they're agents that are developed for WMD. We know they are. In other words, they were researched, developed, and in some cases stockpiled as biologic agents.
Dr. Nicholson and his wife have put all this research on mycoplasma in the book Project Daylily, an American biological warfare tragedy. The Nicholson's book and other articles discuss how mycoplasma was tested on prisoners in Huntsville, Texas, through government, military, and pharmaceutical contracts in the 1980s. Dr. Nicholson scientifically exposes how mycoplasma is linked to the Gulf War syndrome. The Gulf War syndrome is related to CFS and fibromyalgia with the symptoms of fatigue, muscle pain, gastrointestinal issues, low-grade fevers, short-term memory loss, skin rashes, diarrhea, respiratory issues, and more. Over 16% of veterans in the 1991 Persian Gulf War contracted this illness.
Now, the Iraqis admitted that they'd been developing germ warfare agents, but they really didn't find any of these agents after the war, so they said. Actually, that's not true. they did find them. And the reason we heard contrary information about that is because some of these agents were fully deployed on the front lines, and they didn't want to talk about it so much because it really had to do more with the origin of these agents rather than their use. Where did they come from originally? And in fact, many of them came from the United States arsenals supplied to the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War to use against the Iranians. And guess what? They got used against our forces during the war. But this wasn't the major source, we think, of infections like the mycoplasma. And when I testified to Congress, I've done that 6 times. Not that they really had any impact, but at least we were there and put it on the record. The number one source we felt for these illnesses were the microbes that they received as contaminants in the vaccines. Now, most military personnel that were deployed received between 20 and 30 vaccines, generally within a 2 to 3 day period during deployment, which is very, very wrong to do this. It's very immunosuppressive to give all those vaccinations within a short period of time. It just immunosuppresses the patient, or in this case, the subject, and makes them very susceptible to either superinfection or even if there's a contaminant, infection by the contaminant. And this is the link we feel with autistic spectrum disorders, which I'll come back to, the vaccines. And you've probably heard about Camisea, one of the biggest demolition sites immediately after the war, where literally thousands of tons of munitions were blown up by our engineering units. Virtually everyone in those units came down with illness within months after that, and we helped some of them. Now we know that weapons, biologic weapons, were in those bunkers. Why do we know that? Because some of the engineers had their own videotape and took their own video cameras down in the bunkers and started filming the munitions. So this is one of the reasons why you haven't heard a lot about this story, is that it's got a very bad origin. Now, the multiple vaccines were a real problem during the Gulf War, and this is why people weren't even near the conflict, what were deployed to what was called the Kuwaiti Theater of Operations, came down with illness. So we had sailors on ships that were in the Gulf that were nowhere near the conflict. We had other forces that were never sent ashore. We had Marines on ships in a feint to confuse the Iraqis that they were going to be deployed in a landing operation. A lot of these people came down sick as well, and we have to trace it back to the multiple vaccines.
Here is a 2000 study linking vaccination to Gulf War syndrome. In 2006, the paper Immunological Dysfunction, Vaccination and Gulf War Illness also considers vaccines the candidate cause for the illness. Jerry Leonard, a Lyme disease victim who wrote How to Make an AIDS Virus, which we have previously discussed, also addresses Gulf War syndrome in his book, AIDS, the Perfect Disease, the common thread of government experimentation in the acquired immunodeficiency and Gulf War syndrome. The adjuvant squalene in vaccines has also been suspected of contributing to the illness. There are other articles of how mycoplasmas contaminate vaccines. Dr. Nicholson explains the methods of genetic engineering used to weaponize microbes and how they are made heat-resistant with thermo-resistant genes, dry-resistant with spore-forming genes, given cellular entry with receptor genes, made to cause cellular death with toxic genes, made immune-resistant with immunosuppressive genes, and massively produced with growth genes. He shows how the HIV surface protein GP120 has been genetically engineered in the mycoplasma to be able to get into cells. This is what we have seen with the coronavirus.
What we stumbled across, it was all by accident, by the way, was the fact that the military personnel were being given microorganisms that had a piece of the HIV gene. And this is why some of the soldiers that came back were false positive for HIV virus. They didn't have the HIV virus. They had the part of the envelope gene that was inserted into the mycoplasma. And so there were a lot of false positives among military personnel. And families were really upset about this, but they didn't have AIDS. They were showing no signs and symptoms of AIDS. So we think that part of the HIV genome was placed in the mycoplasma to make it more pathogenic. Now here's what we found. We had all this data for years, but we were kind of hesitant to publish it. In fact, we were threatened if we published it, they'd kill us and so on. So I'm showing this publicly for the first time. That Gulf War illness patients, we found that 60% of the mycoplasma positive patients had the HIV-1 envelope sequences. So we didn't find it in every Gulf War illness patient that was positive for mycoplasma. And I don't know the reason for that, except that they were probably testing a number of different things with the vaccine. So there may have been some other sequences that we don't know about. To make HIV virus, you have to have all these genes, dagpol, envelope, rev, so on. Otherwise, you can't make an intact virus that's defective. So we knew that they didn't have HIV. In fact, they had no evidence that they had HIV. They only had the small part of, not even the complete envelope gene, but probably enough of it to produce part of the GP120 complex. Now, in the Huntsville mystery disease patients, it was called mystery disease at the time because they didn't know what it was, from the 1980s, now we found a completely different scenario. We found some that had the envelope gene, some that had another gene, the pol gene, the polymerase gene, some that had the Reb gene. It looked like they were doing a lot of experiments in the prison system, putting in different genes, checking to see how pathogenic they were and so on in the people in the prison system. So this is evidence showing what was going on in the 70s and 80s. Experiments were taking place where we were trying different types of weaponization procedures, trying different countermeasures against things like the mycoplasma, making these different hybrids. When the Gulf War broke out, they'd settled on, or at least mycoplasma fermentans, as one of the microorganisms that they wanted to test in a full-scale operation.
Dr. Nicholson explains that these illnesses are not the result of a single virus, which reflects the old paradigm, but a variety of pathogens, viruses, fungus, and bacteria, in conjunction with the state of one's immune system. Multiple complex conditions can manifest that overlap various types of illnesses and can change into one another.
And this goes back to the old versus new thinking about chronic illnesses. I mentioned that we're not dealing with just one event here, such as infection A going to disease A, poliovirus causing polio. We're talking about a variety of these different infections, chronic infections, together with different immune competency states of the patients, different genetic backgrounds, different toxic environments, different heavy metals, for example, getting together and causing a complex situation, which we call a syndrome. And the reason we call it a syndrome is because it's not tightly knit signs and symptoms. They're very broad, very nonspecific, and so on. So we have to call it a syndrome. They're really diseases, but we call them syndromes.
It needs to be emphasized that multiple pathogens are what create the cytokine storm. Mikovits talks about this as well. Cytokines are immune system proteins responsible for cell signaling, like interferon and interleukin, that when over-released into the blood can create a pathological immune response, in which immune cells attack the body instead of the pathogen. We can imagine this happening when the body is fighting multiple infections at once, as some of these pathogens can go stealth and mimic the body and hijack cellular mechanisms. Many experts see that the cytokine storm is what is fueling COVID deaths. Other bacterial particles like mycoplasma are chlamydia, borrelia, and brucella. The causative agent for Lyme disease is Borrelia burgdorferi, named after the bioweapons researcher Willy Burgdorfer, who infected exotic ticks with Borrelia agents before the epidemic, as Jerry Leonard exposes. Researchers have demonstrated extensive ties between the CDC's Biodefense Unit and the perpetuation of the Lyme disease epidemic. Chlamydia is also a bacterial contaminant found along with strains of mycoplasma. In Part 8, we talked about how the sexually transmitted strain of chlamydia could be a bioweapon. There are 3 strains: Trachomitis, Pneumoniae, and Psittaci. The first strain is the sexually transmitted infection, while the other 2 cause respiratory infections. This paper in the American Society of Microbiology flat out states that Chlamydia psittaci was developed as a bioweapon in the 20th century. This paper is looking at whether that strain of chlamydia evolved into the genital infecting chlamydia trachomitis, as their genome is similar. We know that the evolution of pathogenic viruses occurs through vaccine development. Unsurprisingly, in the 1960s, they created a chlamydia vaccine that was giving people chlamydia. In 2007, Nicholson and others published this study, Evidence for Mycoplasma, Chlamydia pneumoniae, and human herpes virus 6 co-infections in the blood of patients with autistic spectrum disorders. He also connects mycoplasma to COVID-19. Mycoplasma can be aerosolized, which means it can be spread through chemtrails. At this point, it is important to bring up viral aerosolization. Judy Mikovits talks about how she and her peers did not know that retroviruses could be aerosolized until 2009. She also claims that she and her lab workers were infected by aerosolized retroviruses. So while in Part 2 we talked about how natural viruses are not aerosolized as to be infectious, modified viruses can be. We have to be careful with terrain theory because it doesn't address viral bioweapons. Here are some studies on aerosolized viruses. This means that COVID-19 could potentially be aerosolized. Here's a 2004 article, Evidence of Airborne Transmission of the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Virus. Here is a comparison of aerosol and surface stability of both the SARS coronavirus strains 1 and 2. There has been an Italian study detecting COVID-19 in air pollution particles that was confirmed by a blind testing at an independent laboratory. While it seems likely that chemtrails are spreading COVID-19 and other retroviruses, other chemicals and heavy metals being aerosolized also contribute to respiratory and other infections. When we discuss aerosolization, it is important to remember that aerosolized dispersers, generators, and chemtrails would dispense the virus in a way greater quantities and spread than person-to-person transmission. There is much study on the testing of aerosolized bioterrorism agents. According to Garth Nicholson, the Texan prison experiments with mycoplasma was done with aerosols, and it spread to family members of those tested.
I got in a lot of trouble in Texas because we reported that in the prison system that they were using volunteers, prisoners, they were treating them with aerosols of mycoplasma, and they were coming down sick and dying, and then the prison guards got sick, and then their families got sick. In other words, the level of transmission that we saw from the Gulf War was occurring in selected prisons in East Texas.
There can be a transmissibility of infectious pathogens between people. Weaponized bacteria is more easily transmissible, being self-reproducing microorganisms, but modified viruses could be engineered to be infectious and be viable for a short length of time until it finds a host. In regards to COVID-19, Judy Mikovits talks about how there would have to be a significant viral load passed between people, like being coughed and sneezed on profusely by a person with symptoms, in order to get sick, along with some underlying health problems. But not everyone who is really sick is transmitting the virus either. Mikovits claims that healthy people and asymptomatic people don't have retroviruses in their saliva, and she claims that she never wore masks working for BSL-3 labs. Masks do not filter out these tiny pathogens, which are in the nanometer size. Even if larger particulates like saliva are caught by the mask, virions would easily pass through it. In this paper, surgical masks provide a barrier to large particles expelled by the wearer and may help keep spit and mucus generated by the wearer from reaching a patient or medical equipment. However, surgical masks cannot provide certified respiratory protection unless they are also designed, tested, and certified as a respirator. Tiny pathogens, mask wearing should not be enforced on the basis of sovereignty, freedom, and informed consent. Each person has to deal with the consequences for his actions, and therefore requires free will to decide. Would you let your neighbor dictate to you what you can do with your body? Government is no different than your neighbor, except a more corrupted version. You own your body. If you did not own your body, then you would be the property of another. You would be a slave. We live in a slavery system because we believe that the government owns our bodies. As Ron Paul said, when we give government the power to make medical decisions for us, we in essence accept that the state owns our bodies. Even the most brainwashed doctor will admit that there are risks to every medical precaution, device, or treatment. In their book, A Case Against Masks, Mikovits and Heckenlively discuss how decreased oxygen levels and increased carbon dioxide levels that result from breathing through a mask create potential health risks. In this video, Kent Heckenlively shows how the CO2 levels greatly exceed healthy levels.
So, we went over 10,000 parts per million within just 10 breaths.
Continuing the topic of contamination, Corvelva is an Italian advocacy group of independent researchers against coerced vaccination that has tested several vaccines and exposed their contaminants. This has been called Vaccine Gate. In GlaxoSmithKline's 6-in-1 vaccine called Infarex Hexa, Corvelva found 65 chemical contaminants, 8 chemical toxins, 16 free peptide contaminants, and insoluble macromolecules that cannot be recognized by the immune system that are supposed to be soluble proteins. In 2012, a confidential document was leaked exposing 36 infant deaths after taking the vaccine in the 2 years the vaccine was on the market. And we must keep in mind that only 1 to 10% of injuries are reported. A 2018 Corvelva report discusses GlaxoSmithKline's MMR vaccine called Priorix Tetra vaccine. Within the GlaxoSmithKline Priorix Tetra vaccine, proteobacteria, platyhelminths, worms, and nematoda, 10 more ssRNA viruses, microviridæ, bacteria viruses or phage, and numerous retroviruses including endogenous human and avian retroviruses, avian viruses, human immunodeficiency viruses inserted into the database turn out to be fragments of HIV and SIV, marine virus, horse infectious anemia virus, lymphoproliferative disease virus, Row's sarcoma virus, which was one of the first viruses we've talked about in this series. Other viruses like alpha endorna virus and hepatitis B virus, yeast virus. So that was all found in the vaccine. That's fucking insane. The association moms across America found high levels of Roundup's glyphosate in several vaccines. The MMR vaccine had 25 times higher levels than the other vaccines. Dr. Stephanie Seneff, senior researcher at MIT's Computer Science, has presented on the vaccine glyphosate autism connection.
This is 3 curves superimposed, and so you can see that all 3 of these curves kind of coincide. So these 3 are all working synergistically together. I mean, these 2 are working together to cause the autism. The vaccines and the glyphosate are joint partners in an enterprise to cause autism.
A 2017 study in the International Journal of Vaccine and Vaccinations found metallic nanoparticles in vaccines and other metal impurities, like stainless steel, iron particles, tungsten, lead, and other inorganic materials, from 44 vaccines coming from Italy and France. The scientists said the quantity of foreign bodies detected, and in some cases their unusual chemical compositions, baffled us. Dr. Montanari and Dr. Gatti's lab was raided by police.
Important to understand is that those particles can induce diseases and also neurological ones. About 15 years ago, we started to analyze vaccines. At the beginning, it was the University of Mainz, German University of Mainz, that gave us some samples of vaccines to us because they wanted us to analyze them, because those vaccines produced some problems to people who had those particles, those vaccines injected. So they wanted to know why. And we discovered that both vaccine and the tissue, which was hit by the particles contained in the vaccines, because we discovered that those vaccines were polluted by particles, those particles were contained equally in the vaccine and in the tissue. So we started to analyze vaccines. An Italian university, the University of Parma, sent us a student for her thesis, and we analyzed 19 different vaccines with her, finding all of them polluted by micro and nanoparticles. Then we went on analyzing them, and now we analyzed about 30 vaccines with many samples of each vaccine, and we discovered that they were all polluted, all but with a single exception, and that exception was the sole veterinary vaccine, animal vaccine, which we had analyzed.
Now we are going to get into the subject of nanoparticles, their use, contamination, and health concerns, while later we will connect these nano-sized synthetic particles to transhumanism, man merging with machine, the fourth industrial revolution, and the AI technocracy. Nanoparticles are not only a eugenics tool, but a tyrannical one, as nanotechnology is an integral part of technological rulership. Nanotechnology is the art and science of creating and manipulating materials on the nanometer scale, from virus-sized structures to synthetic atoms. Make no mistake, nanotechnology comes straight from the federal government and was not a natural emerging technology based on the free markets or true medical revelation. Here are all the agencies behind it. And its dark, sinister agenda will become very clear towards the end of the series. Nanotechnology has its basis in the military and is inextricable to biowarfare.
We're down in that range of scales where we're looking at viruses and antibodies. That's the length scale, the size scale that we want to make things. And we want to deliberately make those things and have them do stuff for us. We would love to build a micro machine that could ride around inside your body, like the old movie, right? Fantastic Voyage. We can manipulate stuff on the atomic scale, and we can put it where we want it to be.
and we can put it where we want it to be.
So that means we can deliberately locate it. So we can deliberately force it to have a certain structure.
So we can deliberately force it to have a certain structure. It's all about power and control at the nanoscale.
Biology is very impressive and intricate, clever, but also very suboptimal compared to what we ultimately will be able to engineer with nanotechnology. We are building devices now that are at the nanoscale. This is a design of a robotic red blood cell. Conservative analysis of these resporocytes shows that if you were to replace a portion of your red blood cells with these robotic versions, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. We'll be able to download software against specific pathogens, including ones that have never been seen before, not be subject to autoimmune disorders. And if you look at what will be in principle feasible with nanotechnology, we can go far beyond the limitations of our version 1 bodies.
There are many types of nanoparticles, organic and inorganic, and organic-inorganic hybrids, called composites. There is carbon-based, ceramic, metallic, polymeric, lipid-based nanoparticles, hydrogels, silica-based, and more. Nanoparticles can be magnetic, optical, semiconductors, and biosensors. Nanorobotics are robotic and machine-like structures at the nanoscale, being made for drug delivery and monitoring bodily signals through microchips and quantum dots.
It's time to get small. Remember how not too long ago computer chip makers were desperate to overcome manufacturing barriers that were keeping them from making chips in the 32 nanometer class? Good times, as IBM just announced they have successfully produced chips at the 5 nanometer level. A little computer chip 101 here. The smaller you can make the transistors on a computer chip, the more you can cram into a given amount of space, increasing memory density, performance, and speed.
Microtechnology is larger than nanotechnology, but has similar applications. Neural dust or smart dust are implantable sensors, 1 millimeter cubed.
But one day soon, we'll put tiny implants the size of a grain of rice inside our bodies. Next to organs, alongside nerves, inside blood vessels, maybe someday even in our brain.
This is related to microrobotics. All these biotechnologies have the larger goal to merge biology with computer and machine.
50 years of development in microelectronics have given us a fantastic array of tiny computer systems. But that is only half the puzzle. A robot also needs to move, and now researchers have created a brand new type of actuator which can do it, giving the tiny brains some brawn. Swarms of robots so small that they can be injected through a hypodermic syringe, and collected using a pipette.
We are getting ahead of ourselves with the technology, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse of where things are headed. Returning back to nanoparticles, according to this article, as of 2007, the National Science Foundation estimated that up to $70 billion worth of nanotechnology-enabled products were sold in the United States annually, and that number is predicted to grow explosively. And then it says that manufacturers are not presently required to report the use of engineered nanoparticles, except for single and multi-walled carbon nanotubes, and that manufacturers are also not required to label products containing engineered nanoparticles. The FDA says that it does not make a categorical judgment that nanotechnology is inherently safe or harmful, but allows nanotechnology to be used unregulated. Nanoparticles like silver iron oxide, titanium dioxide, silicon dioxide, and zinc oxide are used in food for flavor, color, and preservatives, even though they are known to produce cytotoxicity. This is being done without the public's consent and is a huge crime against humanity.
Recently, some fizzy drinks have become brighter and fruitier looking thanks to nanotechnology. Table salt trickles more evenly than ever thanks to nanoparticles. And some ketchup brands now provide products that stick to your chips without a single drop sticking to the bottle, an achievement nothing short of nanotastic. These amazing little specks can't be seen with the naked eye. They're man-made and tens of thousands of times finer than a human hair. Nano, as it were, is quickly gaining a reputation as the technology of the millennium. Still, not everyone believes it to be purely beneficial. Dr. Wolfgang Kraling has researched how somatic cells respond to foreign nanoparticles. But according to his findings, they can in fact enter the human body either via food intake, respiration, or exposure to skin tissue, and once inside the bloodstream, they are readily dispersed.
We have found evidence that these particles go on to organs like the liver, spleen and kidneys, all of which combat toxins. However, traces have even been spotted in the heart and brain.
Nanoparticles can thus embed themselves in the brain, and scientists have only begun to research the side effects. What is known is that nanoparticles are so resilient that the human body is virtually incapable of breaking them down, and when organs can't defend themselves, they're prone to contracting diseases.
Zum einen kann die Herzrhythmusfunktion gestört werden und zum anderen
It could cause cardiac arrhythmia or alter normal blood clotting functions. More severe scenarios, such as heart attacks or thrombosis, are thus not out of the question.
beziehungsweise thrombotische Effekte.
Certain nanoparticles scattered atop the surface of cheese can prevent the contents in a packet of slices from sticking to each other. In car paint, nanotechnology can repel the sun's rays to prevent fading. And the sun-blocking particles used to protect car surfaces are the same ones used in sunscreen. It's becoming increasingly evident that nanoparticles could lead to illness. Nevertheless, there are currently no regulations in place to limit the implementation of this recent and unprecedented technology.
Studies have shown that genetic alteration is a potential consequence of nanoparticles in food or nanoengineering of food. This article says that nanoparticles can have serious effects on health when they accumulate in high concentrations in tissues, eventually leading to tissue dysfunction and damage. Nanoparticles like titanium dioxide and zinc oxide are used in sunscreen. Other personal care products and cosmetics use nanoparticles. There are many studies of the potential harmful effects of nanoparticles. Here are just a few. Nanoparticles have been shown to cause oxidative stress. Nanoparticles can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause brain cell damage. The negative impact of nanoparticles on the brain has been researched. This article discusses how molecular, cellular, organ, and immune toxicity is observed with metallic and carbon-based nanoparticles. And then it goes on to say that these hazardous properties do not hinder their use for medical purposes. This article goes into how nanoparticle contaminants are released into the environment that harm microbes, plants, and animals and enable chemical reactions that create toxic chemicals like free radicals. Traffic emissions, metal refineries, wastewater, clothing, and medicine are some of the pathways nanoparticles are released into the environment. Here is an image of a nanoparticle found in the brain that is likely from air pollution. Besides the pollution from industry, chemtrails is a big way nanoparticles get into the environment. These particles can cause disease and neurodegeneration. But of course, they always act as if the problem is the solution to cause more of the problem. They are openly geoengineering with nanoparticles. Dr. Russell Blaylock was a practicing neurosurgeon for 24 years and has published over 40 medical articles in peer-reviewed journals. He warns of aluminum nanoparticles and chemtrails.
The main reason I got you on the program was your recent article about the nano-aluminum particles in the chemtrails, and I think it's just so important that people understand what's going on here. So could you tell me what got you interested in this and what started you writing this, this recent paper?
Well, the connection has been the aluminum in the vaccines. I wrote several articles about the effect of the adjuvants in vaccines, including the mercury and the aluminum effect. Then I found some articles about the chemtrails, and there was a lot being said about it, and I wasn't too sure whether it was true or not, because in my state we rarely saw them. But as I started looking on the internet, and I would see these states in which there were these crisscross patterns, and they were very tight patterns, and where it was obviously it was a purposeful covering of the atmosphere with these patterns. And the trails were so long, well now, we're starting to see them in my state. And so I looked into the literature and some of the reports and YouTube videos, and they were saying that they were dropping one of the ingredients was aluminum. Well, I had done a fair amount of writing and research on the effect of aerosolized chemicals in the nose when you breathe them. And what we knew was that these particles tend to travel along the olfactory nerves, which are the smell nerves in the nose, and it travels directly to the part of the brain that has to do with memory and emotions, the hippocampus, the entorhinal area, and the prefrontal cortex, and that you can trace these chemicals traveling along that nerve and depositing in this area of the brain. The other thing that was known is that if you aerosolize aluminum, it's one of the metals that passes very easily along this track and directly into the brain, so it bypasses the blood-brain barrier and goes directly into the brain and accumulates. Well, if you do it in animals, it produces lesions or damage in that area of the brain, and the animal will begin to show changes of memory and learning and emotional changes. When we look at people who have Alzheimer's disease, ironically, the highest concentration of aluminum in the brain is that same entry point, what's called the entorhinal cortex, and the levels continue to accumulate. So we have compelling evidence that aerosolized aluminum alone will enter the brain and produce damage to that critical area of the brain. The worst of all is the nanosize. Now, nanosize means you make it such a small particle that it easily penetrates skin, it penetrates barriers in the body that normally metals cannot pass through. When you nanosize and produce these incredibly small particulate matter, it passes very easily. So when you nanosize aluminum and you use it in these aerosols through the nasal passages, it enters the brain in very high concentrations. And they found that the nanosized aluminum in the brain is infinitely more toxic. Now, one of the toxic reactions to aluminum is intense inflammation and activation of cells in the brain that are the immune cells called microglia. Aluminum is a very potent activator of these immune cells, and that triggers the release of a powerful substance called glutamate, which is an excitotoxin that causes cells to die from an excitatory mechanism, kind of complex mechanism, but it is a combination of inflammation and excitotoxicity. The reports are coming out now that what they're spraying is nanosized aluminum, and the idea is the whole concept of preventing global warming. And they nanosize the aluminum so it'll stay in the upper atmosphere longer, supposedly as a reflective compound, metal. The problem with that, even from a climatologic description, is that if you make it into cirrus-like clouds rather than reflecting it upward and out of the atmosphere, it reflects the heat downward and actually causes global warming. So you could envision that they're doing this on purpose to make the atmosphere heat up so they can see the atmosphere is warming up. But what I'm concerned about mainly is the medical effect, and that's because of this very strong connection between aluminum passing through this pathway into the brain is so strongly connected with Alzheimer's disease and other diseases of memory. The evidence now from the examination by biologists and scientists around the world is that the aluminum level in the lakes and streams and trees is increasing enormously. Some areas have incredible elevations of aluminum in the groundwater and in the vegetation. So if this indeed is happening, we're looking at a medical catastrophe that's worldwide.
Dr. Lawrence Palevsky has also spoken to a panel about aluminum nanoparticles in vaccines, likely contributing to neurological disease.
I was starting to hear stories from parents, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of stories from parents who took a very healthy child into their doctor's office and then found that their child lost much of their health, whether it was their speech, whether it was seizures, whether it was death, whether it was asthma, allergies, eczema, whether it was autism, whether it was learning disabilities, whether it was inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune diseases. And every one of those parents were told it had nothing to do with the vaccine. And this continues today. But yet, when I look at the ingredients that are in the vaccines, I have the science to actually explain how these medical problems could be happening in these children. When I was in medical school, we were taught that the body has something called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is like Fort Knox to the brain. Elements of the bloodstream cannot get into the brain, and those elements include drugs, viruses, and bacteria, among other things that are in the blood. Drug companies were very concerned about being able to develop drugs to get the drugs into the brain. And so they used something called a nanoparticle. Nanoparticle, very small particle, bound to the drug. And they found that if they could put a nanoparticle onto a drug, they could get that drug to go into the brain. And it shows in animal studies that they were able to do this. They then were able to take an emulsifier, which is something that's good with water and fat. It can dissolve in both. And if they added the emulsifier to the nanoparticle bound to the drug, they could increase drug entry into the brain 20-fold. This is right out of animal studies that I've found. So you have a drug, you have a nanoparticle, and you have this emulsifier. The vaccines are constructed the same way. You have the vaccine viruses and bacteria that are bound to a nanoparticle called aluminum. And that aluminum is a nanoparticle. And by definition, a nanoparticle has the potential to enter the brain.
A chapter in the book, Vaccine Design, is dedicated to nanoparticles as adjuvants. Nanotechnology was used in the HPV vaccine, a vaccine with horrific adverse reactions that we discussed in Part 8. Nanoparticles are now openly being put in vaccines. Here is a patent for vaccine nanotechnology by MIT in 2017. This 2019 article uses the term nanovaccinology, claiming that nanoparticles used as vehicles of vaccine components are able to increase hosts' immune response. And that's because they are more harmful. The types of nanoparticles being used as synthetic delivery systems in the range of 20 to 200 nanometers are viral-like particles, self-assembled proteins, micelles, lymphosomes, inorganic nanoparticles, and polymers. Both the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna's COVID-19 vaccines openly use nanotechnology.
This is the ingredients for the Pfizer BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine. I'd like to draw your attention to these couple of things. The lipid ALK. They are the lipid nanoparticles that carry and protect the mRNA from degradation.
Either if we want to deliver oligonucleotides such as DNA, the plasmid DNA, or the mRNA, as mentioned before by Christine, is done by Moderna, BioNTech, for the DNAs with the CanSino and some other companies. Also peptides directly, we need to protect them. So in this case, we need to protect them from degradation in the blood. We need to protect them from RNases, DNases, and so on. So we use the nanoparticles for packaging them. And at the same time, in many of the cases, we want to deliver them together with other components that will activate the immune system, such as different adjuvants that are TLR activators.
The technology of DNA and RNA vaccines using nanoparticles began with DARPA and has had much funding from Bill Gates. The COVID-19 PCR test uses a nasopharyngeal swab, but there is much suspicion that they are in fact a form of vaccination. An article came out saying, yes, they can vaccinate us through nasal test swabs and target the brain. Dr. Lorraine Day, former ortho.
Yes, just when it was starting to get good, huh? And you can go watch more of that from Jenna and her series on let's get it right. There's quite a few words there. Tyranny and Eugenics Through Public Health, Bioterrorism, and Vaccines, Part 9. And I would suggest starting at the beginning and going all the way through. And, she's going to come out with more. And I was glad we were able to feature that. I felt like today I was really able to kind of draw a few loops that I'd been kind of panning out with the first 5 episodes of Bio-PsyWar. And I will continue to produce episodes of the Bio-PsyWar, as we're living in the Bio-PsyWar. So it's not that hard to curate the content as I'm going through and doing the research. As I said, I've got a few new books that showed up, including Gene Wars and Operation Paperclip, and we'll be going in and linking that up, as well as hopefully getting some interviews on board. I also have Creature of Control episodes that are coming up, the reintroduction to the creature, a slide deck prepared with that one, and we'll be going through and more of the psychological aspects of the Bio-PsyWar. So today's been Bio-PsyWar, the Tick-Tok Bio-Op, the Tick-Tokeration in the Bio-PsyWar. So thanks for tuning in to the TylerBloyer.com live stream. Share this out to your friends and family who may be interested in going through this sort of material. I appreciate any feedback. I appreciate the people who watch live, and I appreciate the people who download the podcasts and check out the alternative platforms off of the YouTube library, BitChute, and Float being the main places that I mirror the content as well. So again, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you later next week perhaps, and if not, then the week after that. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.